I spent Christmas Eve eating leftover pasta alone in my apartment, staring at the one string of lights I'd bothered to hang. My parents had called 2 weeks earlier with the news, "We just can't afford a big gathering this year, sweetheart. Money's tight. You understand?" I understood. I always understood. So when my phone buzzed at 9 p.m, with a flood of photos from the family group chat, I assumed someone had sent old pictures by mistake. But then I saw the date stamp. December 25th. Today. My entire family, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone gathered around a brand new SUV with a giant red bow on top. My sister Sophie stood in the centre car keys, dangling from her fingers, tears of joy streaming down her face. And my father's voice in the video, "This is from the fund we've been saving for 7 years. You deserve this, sweetheart." 7 years. They'd been saving for 7 years while telling me there was no money for Christmas. 3 days later, my father called asking for $37,000. What would you have done? My name is Taylor Collins. I'm 36 years old and I work as a senior financial analyst at a consulting firm downtown. I've built a comfortable life for myself, a nice apartment, a reliable car, a growing retirement account, but I've never been one to broadcast my success. In my family, staying quiet has always been easier than speaking up. Growing up as the oldest daughter in the Collins family taught me one lesson early: some children are seen and some children are needed. I was the needed one. Sophie, my younger sister by 4 years, was the seen one. It wasn't always obvious. When we were very young, I remember feeling equally loved. Mum would braid both our hair on Sunday mornings. Dad would take turns pushing us on the backyard swing. But somewhere along the way, the scales tipped. Sophie developed anxiety in middle school, and suddenly everything revolved around protecting her, making sure she felt safe, making sure she never struggled too hard. I understood at first. I wanted to protect her too, but understanding slowly turned into invisibility. By high school, the pattern was set. When Sophie failed a class, my parents hired her a tutor and took her out for ice cream to lift her spirits. When I made the honour roll, I got a nod and a "we knew you could do it." When Sophie's first car broke down, they bought her a newer one within the week. When mine broke down 2 years later, I was told to save up and figure it out myself because I was resourceful like that. I never complained, not once. I told myself it was because I was stronger, more capable, more independent. But the truth was simpler and sadder. I was afraid that if I asked for more, I'd get even less. My grandmother saw it though. Grandma Rose was the only person who ever looked at me, like I wasn't just the responsible one, I was someone worth worrying about too. I remember sitting on her porch the summer before she passed. I was 23, freshly graduated, about to start my first real job. Sophie had just dropped out of her second college, and my parents were in crisis mode rearranging their finances to support her fresh start. Grandma Rose took my hand and said something I've never forgotten. "Your father loves you, Taylor, but he's gotten lazy with that love because you never demand it. Strength shouldn't mean loneliness. Promise me you'll remember that." I promised, but promises made at 23 are hard to keep at 36, especially when keeping the peace becomes your entire identity. So when my parents called me 2 weeks before Christmas with their announcement, I did what I always did. I accepted it. "Taylor, honey, we need to talk to you about the holidays this year," Mum said, her voice carrying that particular softness she used when delivering bad news. "Your father and I have been looking at our finances, and we just can't swing a big gathering. Things are tight. You understand, don't you?" "Of course," I said automatically. "We can do something small. I could bring a dish and we could just have dinner together." There was a pause. "Actually, we were thinking maybe we'd skip this year altogether. Just rest. Keep things low-key." I felt a small sting, but I pushed it down. They were getting older. Money was tight for everyone these days. Who was I to make them feel guilty? "That's fine, Mum. Really, we'll celebrate another time." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and told myself all the reasonable things. They were tired. They were struggling. It wasn't personal. I almost believed it. But that very night, as I was cleaning out my inbox, I stumbled upon something that made me question everything I just accepted as truth. The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas. I was still at my desk finishing up a quarterly report that needed to go out before the holiday break when my phone buzzed with a new message notification. I glanced at it, expecting work correspondence, but instead I saw my mother's name in the sender line. The subject read, "Re Sophie's Big Day," and below it a preview of text that made my fingers freeze over my keyboard. I opened it immediately, assuming Mom had meant to send me something about holiday plans. But as I scrolled through the message, I realised this was never intended for my eyes at all. Mum had accidentally forwarded an entire email chain, one that stretched back several weeks and included my father, my Aunt Linda, and my Uncle Robert. The conversation was detailed, excited, and absolutely devastating to read. "The fund is finally ready," my father had written in the first message, dated early November. "After all these years of saving, we can finally give Sophie the Christmas she deserves. I've already put down the deposit on the car. Silver exterior, just like she wanted." My mother's reply came next, filled with exclamation points and heart emojis that I had to read twice to believe. "I cannot wait to see her face. This is going to be the most unforgettable Christmas ever. She has worked so hard and been through so much. Our baby girl deserves this moment." Aunt Linda had chimed in about bringing a special cake. Uncle Robert mentioned he would handle the decorations for the big reveal. There were discussions about who would record the video, what time everyone should arrive, and how to keep Sophie from suspecting anything. Not once in any of these messages was my name mentioned. Not once did anyone suggest inviting me or wonder how I might feel about being excluded. The gathering they were planning was elaborate, joyful, and completely hidden from me. I sat back in my chair, my chest tight, reading the words over and over as if repetition might change their meaning. The fund we've been building, after all these years of saving, the Christmas she deserves. 2 days ago, my mother had told me they couldn't afford a family gathering. She had used the word tight to describe their finances. She had made it sound like even a simple dinner was beyond their means. And yet, here was proof in black and white that they had been saving money for years specifically to buy my sister a car. My first instinct was to assume there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe the fund was something separate, something that didn't affect their regular budget. Maybe the car was a loan or a lease that only seemed expensive. I wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation because the alternative meant my parents had looked me in the eye and lied. I decided to call my mother. I kept my voice light, casual, as if I were just checking in after a long day at work. We chatted for a few minutes about nothing in particular before I mentioned the email. "Hey, Mum, I think you accidentally forwarded me something meant for someone else. Something about Sophie's big day." The silence on the other end of the line lasted just a beat too long. When Mum finally spoke, her voice had shifted into that higher register she always used when she was nervous. "Oh, that's nothing, sweetheart. Just some silly family gossip. You know how your aunt gets about birthdays and things. I must have hit forward by mistake." "It mentioned a fund," I said carefully. "And a car. A car? No, I don't know what you're talking about. Listen, honey, I have something on the stove. Can I call you back later?" She didn't call back. I didn't expect her to. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and began doing something I had avoided for years. I started thinking back through all the times my parents had claimed financial hardship while simultaneously showering Sophie with expensive gifts. The pattern was there clear as day once I allowed myself to see it. 3 years ago, they said they couldn't help me with a down payment on my apartment because money was tight. That same year, they paid for Sophie's 2-week vacation to Europe because she needed to find herself. 2 years ago, they told me they were cutting back on holiday gifts for everyone. I received a gift card for $50. Sophie received a designer handbag that cost at least 10 times that amount. Last year, they said they couldn't attend my work award ceremony because they couldn't afford the travel. A month later, they flew across the country for Sophie's friend's destination wedding, staying in a beachfront hotel for 5 nights. The examples kept coming, each one a small wound I had dismissed at the time, but now recognised as part of a larger pattern. Every sacrifice they claimed to make, every budget they said was stretched too thin, somehow never applied when Sophie was involved. I could have confronted them right then. I could have called back and demanded answers, forced them to explain why they had lied to me about Christmas while planning an elaborate celebration for my sister. Part of me wanted to do exactly that, to finally say the words I had been swallowing for 30 years. But another part of me, the part that had learned to observe rather than react, decided to wait. If my parents were capable of this kind of deception, then confronting them now would only give them time to create excuses, to craft explanations that would make me feel guilty for doubting them. I knew how that conversation would go. I would be the ungrateful daughter, the jealous sister, the one who couldn't just be happy for Sophie. So instead of calling, instead of accusing, I made a different choice. I would let Christmas come. I would see what they did, what they said, and whether anyone in my family would think to include me in the celebration they were so carefully planning. I told myself I was being strategic. I told myself I was gathering information before making any decisions. But deep down, I think I was just hoping I was wrong. Hoping that somehow, despite everything I had read, there was still a chance my family hadn't completely forgotten I existed. Christmas would reveal the truth, and it would reveal far more than I ever imagined. Christmas arrived with the kind of quiet that settles into your bones. I woke up late, having no reason to rise early, and made myself a cup of coffee that I drank standing by the window. The street below was empty except for a few cars parked along the curb, their owners presumably inside warm homes surrounded by family. I watched a woman across the street carry a covered dish from her car to her front door, where someone was already waiting to embrace her. I turned away before I could see them hug. I had decided not to call my parents. Part of me still hoped they might reach out first, might remember that their oldest daughter was spending the holiday alone, and at least send a text wishing me well. By noon, my phone remained silent except for an automated holiday greeting from my dentist's office and a promotional email from a store I had shopped at once 3 years ago. For dinner, I heated up leftover pasta from a batch I had made earlier in the week. The sauce had thickened in the refrigerator, and the noodles stuck together in clumps that I didn't bother to separate. I ate at my small kitchen table, the only sounds in the apartment coming from my fork against the bowl and the distant rumble of a car passing on the street outside. The one string of Christmas lights I had hung in my living room blinked steadily in the corner, their cheerful colours feeling almost mocking in the empty space. After dinner, I found myself drawn to a box I kept in my closet, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old family photographs and Christmas cards collected over decades, memories I had packed away because looking at them had become too painful. But tonight, in my solitude, I felt the need to remember a time when things were different. The first photo I pulled out was from Christmas when I was 8 years old. Sophie would have been 4, still young enough to believe in Santa, with absolute certainty. In the picture, we were both wearing matching red pajamas, sitting in front of a tree that seemed enormous compared to our small bodies. Dad had his arms around both of us, his smile wide and genuine. Mum was captured mid-laugh, reaching toward us as if she couldn't wait to join the embrace. We all looked happy. We all looked loved. I found card after card from those early years, each one signed by both my parents with personal messages that showed thought and care. To our brilliant tailor, one read, "May this year bring you as much joy as you bring us." Another said, "Our 2 girls are our greatest treasures. We love you both to the moon and back." When did those messages stop being about both of us? When did I become just a signature at the bottom, while Sophie got paragraphs of praise and encouragement? I couldn't pinpoint an exact moment, couldn't identify a single turning point. The shift had been so gradual that I'd absorbed it, without question, like a frog slowly boiling in water that heated so gently it never thought to jump out. I set down the photos and leaned back in my chair, trying to talk myself out of the resentment building in my chest. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe my parents really were struggling financially, and the email I had seen was about something they had saved for over many years, specifically for Sophie. It didn't mean they didn't love me. It didn't mean they had lied with malicious intent. Perhaps they were embarrassed to admit they could only afford one big gift, and rather than hurt my feelings, they had simply cancelled Christmas altogether. I wanted to believe this version of events. I wanted to be the understanding daughter who didn't keep score, who didn't measure love in dollars and cents. Grandma Rose had always told me that resentment was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I didn't want to poison myself with bitterness over what might be a simple misunderstanding. By the time evening settled fully over the city, I had almost convinced myself to let it go. I washed my single dish and fork, put away the box of memories, and settled onto my couch with a book I had been meaning to read for months. The apartment was warm, the lights were soft, and if I tried hard enough, I could almost pretend this was a peaceful evening by choice rather than by circumstance. Then my phone exploded. The device had been sitting silently on the coffee table all day, but suddenly it began buzzing repeatedly, notification after notification, flooding in faster than I could process. I grabbed it and saw the family group chat lighting up with message after message. Photos were appearing in rapid succession, accompanied by strings of excited text from aunts and cousins and people I hadn't heard from in months. Best Christmas ever. Read one message from Aunt Linda. Sophie's face was priceless, wrote my cousin Marcus. So happy we could all be together for this special moment, added Uncle Robert. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the images. There was my mother's dining room decorated with garlands and ribbons I had never seen before. The table was set for at least 15 people, loaded with dishes that must have taken days to prepare. Faces I recognised from childhood smiled at the camera, holding glasses raised in celebration. And in the centre of every shot, surrounded by love and attention, was Sophie. I saw my father with his arm around her shoulders. I saw my mother pressing a kiss to her cheek. I saw cousins and aunts and uncles I hadn't spoken to in years, all gathered in a room that radiated warmth and joy, and everything I had been told was financially impossible. My throat tightened as I continued scrolling, each image a fresh confirmation of the lie I had been told. They weren't too broke for a gathering. They simply hadn't wanted me there. And then I reached a photo that made my heart drop into my stomach. In the driveway, illuminated by strings of lights, sat a brand new silver SUV with an enormous red bow on its hood. Sophie stood beside it, keys dangling from her fingers, tears streaming down her face. The caption beneath read, 7 years of saving finally paid off. Our baby girl deserves the world. I stared at that photo until my eyes burned, until every detail of the scene had seared itself into my memory. The silver SUV gleaming under the Christmas lights. The red bow that must have cost a fortune on its own. My sister's face radiant with shock and gratitude, tears catching the light as they rolled down her cheeks. Behind her stood our entire family, their expressions captured in a moment of pure celebration, and not one of them had thought to wonder where I was. My thumb moved almost involuntarily, scrolling further through the group chat to find the video that had been posted alongside the photos. I pressed play and immediately wished I hadn't. The footage was shaky, clearly recorded on someone's phone, but the audio was crisp enough to hear every word. The camera panned across the crowded living room, past familiar faces I hadn't seen in person for years, all of them grinning and whispering in anticipation. "She's coming," I heard my mother say, her voice high with excitement. "Everyone get ready." The front door opened and Sophie walked in, clearly having been sent on some invented errand to get her out of the house. The moment she crossed the threshold, the room erupted in cheers. Confetti fell from somewhere above. People I had grown up with, people I had shared holidays and birthdays and family dinners with my entire life were shouting and clapping and rushing forward to embrace my sister. "What is this?" Sophie gasped on the video, her hands flying to her face. "What's going on?" My father stepped forward then, and the camera zoomed in on him as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of car keys attached to a silver bow. The room fell silent, everyone watching as Dad took Sophie's hand and placed the keys in her palm. "Sophie, my beautiful girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your mother and I have been saving for 7 years to give you this. We know life hasn't always been easy for you, and we wanted you to know just how much you mean to us. This is from the fund we've been building since you were just a kid. You deserve this, sweetheart. You deserve everything." Sophie burst into tears, throwing her arms around Dad's neck, while the room exploded into fresh applause. The camera followed as the entire group poured outside into the driveway, where the SUV sat waiting like a throne. More cheering, more hugging. Sophie running her hands over the hood of the car, as if she couldn't believe it was real. I watched my mother kiss Sophie's forehead. I watched my aunts take turns posing with her beside the driver's door. I watched cousins I had played with as a child hold up their phones to record the moment their faces bright with second-hand joy. And through all of it, through every minute of the video, that stretched on for nearly 10 minutes of celebration, not a single person mentioned my name. No one said, "I wish Taylor could be here." No one texted me separately to say, "We miss you, Merry Christmas." No one seemed to notice or care that the gathering they had told me was financially impossible was happening without me, as if my absence was so normal it didn't even warrant acknowledgement. I set my phone down on the coffee table and sat perfectly still. The apartment around me had never felt so quiet. The Christmas lights in the corner kept blinking, their steady rhythm red and green and gold, reflecting off the walls of a room that suddenly felt less like a home, and more like a place where I had been storing myself while my real life happened somewhere else without me. 7 years. They had been saving for 7 years. I tried to calculate what that meant. Tried to imagine my parents setting aside money, month after month, year after year, while telling me they couldn't afford to visit, couldn't afford to help with my apartment deposit, couldn't afford to do anything that might benefit me. Every excuse, every apology, every time they had made me feel guilty for even asking had been a lie, built on top of a fund that was growing steadily in the background. And it wasn't just the money, it was the gathering itself. The family I thought was too scattered, too busy, too broke to come together for Christmas had assembled in full force the moment Sophie was involved. Aunts flew in from other states. Cousins rearranged their schedules. Everyone found a way to be there because Sophie was getting a car, and Sophie needed to feel loved, and Sophie deserved an unforgettable moment. What did I deserve leftover pasta and an empty apartment? I picked up my phone again and scrolled through the group chat one more time, reading every comment and response. There were heart emojis and exclamation points. There were posts saying, "Family is everything," and "so grateful for moments like this." There were inside jokes and shared memories and plans to do this again next year. Nowhere in any of it was there a single mention of the daughter who was missing the sister who had been specifically excluded. I thought about calling. I thought about texting something, anything, just to remind them I existed. But what would I say? Congratulations on the family gathering. I wasn't invited to best wishes for the car funded by the savings you told me didn't exist. I couldn't find words that wouldn't make me sound bitter, and I couldn't find feelings that weren't exactly that. So I sat in silence, watching the minutes tick by on my phone, wondering if this hollow ache in my chest was something I would have to carry forever. The lights blinked. The apartment stayed quiet. Outside my window, the world continued celebrating a holiday that had left me behind. At exactly 10 that night, just as I was about to give up and go to bed, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my breath catch. It was Dad. I didn't answer the phone that night. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then sat staring at the screen until the notification popped up telling me Dad had left a message. I couldn't bring myself to listen to it. Whatever he had to say, I wasn't ready to hear it. Not while the images from the family gathering were still fresh in my mind, not while I could still see Sophie's tearful face, and the gleaming silver SUV, and all those relatives who hadn't thought to send me even a simple holiday greeting. 3 days passed. I went back to work, buried myself in reports and meetings, and tried to pretend that Christmas hadn't happened at all. But the family group chat kept buzzing with photos and comments, each notification a small reminder of everything I had been excluded from. I muted the conversation, but couldn't bring myself to leave it entirely. Some foolish part of me still hoped someone would notice my silence and reach out. On the evening of December 28th, Dad called again. This time, I answered. I told myself I was ready, that I had processed enough of my feelings to have a calm conversation. I was wrong. "Taylor, sweetheart." Dad said, his voice warm and familiar in a way that made my chest ache. "I've been trying to reach you. How have you been? How was your Christmas?" The question landed like a slap. How was my Christmas? Did he genuinely not know, or was he pretending I couldn't tell which possibility hurt more? "It was quiet," I said carefully. "Just me and some leftovers." "Well, that sounds peaceful," he replied, completely missing the weight behind my words. "Sometimes a quiet holiday is exactly what we need. Your mother and I had the whole family over, you know. It was chaotic, but wonderful. Sophie was so surprised by her gift." I waited for him to acknowledge that I hadn't been there. I waited for an apology, an explanation, even a flimsy excuse. Instead, he just moved on. "Listen, honey, the reason I'm calling is because the family is in a bit of a financial bind right now. You know how it is, the holidays always cost more than you expect, and we've had some unexpected expenses come up." My grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of expenses?" "Medical bills mostly. Your mother needs some tests done, and you know insurance doesn't cover everything these days. We've been looking at our accounts and trying to figure out how to make ends meet, and I thought, maybe you could help us out." Oh. There it was. After all the years of being overlooked, after being told there was no money for Christmas, after watching my entire family celebrate without me, Dad was calling to ask for help. The irony was so sharp I almost laughed. "How much do you need?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Dad paused, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something more careful. "Well, we've run the numbers, and to cover everything, plus get caught up on a few other bills, we'd need about $37,000. $37,000? The number hung in the air between us, enormous and absurd. That wasn't a small loan to cover an unexpected expense. That was a life-changing amount of money, the kind of sum that takes years to save. "That's a lot, Dad," I said slowly. "I thought you had savings. In the video, you told Sophie you'd been building a fund for 7 years. The silence on his end stretched long enough that I could hear him breathing. When he finally responded, his words came out tangled and uncertain. "Well, yes, we had that fund, but we used it for Sophie's car. That was the whole point of it. And now with these medical bills coming up, we don't have anything left in reserve. We gave everything to Sophie because she needed it." "You gave everything to Sophie," I repeated. "And now you need me to give you $37,000. It's not like that, Taylor. You know we wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Sophie needed that car to stabilize her life. She's been struggling so much trying to get her career off the ground, and reliable transportation is essential for her job prospects. We couldn't let her keep driving that old thing that broke down every other month." I closed my eyes and pressed my free hand against my forehead, trying to contain the emotions threatening to spill over. "Dad, you told me you couldn't afford a family gathering this year. You said money was tight, but you had enough to buy Sophie a brand new SUV and throw a party for 15 people. That was different. That was planned. We'd been saving specifically for that. And you didn't think to include me in any of it. Not the planning, not the gathering, not even a phone call to wish me Merry Christmas." Another pause, this one heavy with something I couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance at being questioned. "Taylor, you know how Sophie is. She needed this more than you did. You've always been the strong one, the independent one. You've got your career and your apartment and your life together. Sophie is still finding her way. We have to support her, while she figures things out. And what about supporting me? The words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't try to soften them. When do I get a fund? When do I get a party? When does anyone in this family ask how I'm doing without wanting something in return? That's not fair, Dad said, his voice hardening. We've always loved you both equally. Just because we help Sophie more doesn't mean we love you less. You've never needed our help the way she does. I've never needed it because I learned a long time ago not to ask. Because every time I did, I was told to figure it out myself. Taylor, I don't have time for this argument right now. We have real problems to deal with. Can you help us with the money or not? I stood up from my couch and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street below. 36 years of swallowing my feelings of keeping the peace, of being the responsible daughter who never complained. And here was my father completely blind to the hurt he had caused, asking me to write a check and move on. Something inside me shifted. It was small at first, like a crack forming in a wall that had been bearing too much weight for too long. Then the crack spread, and suddenly everything I had been holding back came rushing forward. And I said something I never thought I would say to my own father. The words came out of my mouth before I could second-guess them, before the old habit of keeping peace could silence me like it always had. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as if someone else had taken control of the conversation, and I was just watching from somewhere deep inside myself. Dad, I don't fund lies. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I didn't stop. The crack in the wall had become a flood, and everything I'd been holding back for decades was finally pouring through. You told me there was no money for Christmas. You told me the family couldn't afford to get together this year. I believed you. I spent Christmas alone in my apartment eating leftover pasta while you threw a party for 15 people and bought Sophie a brand new car. And now you're calling me 3 days later asking for $37,000 because you emptied your savings on a gift for the daughter you actually care about. Now hold on just a minute, Dad started, but I cut him off. No, you hold on. I've been holding on for 36 years. I've been holding my tongue every time you forgot my birthday, but threw Sophie a surprise party. I've been holding back tears every time you told me to figure things out myself while you handed her everything she ever wanted. I've been holding this family together with my silence, and I'm done. Dad's voice shifted from surprise to defensive. Taylor, you're blowing this way out of proportion. We didn't exclude you from Christmas on purpose. We just thought you'd prefer a quiet holiday. You always say you like your space. I like my space because I learned that's all I was going to get. When was the last time you actually invited me to something? When was the last time anyone in this family called just to ask how I was doing, not because they needed money or a favour? That's ridiculous. We call you all the time. You call me when you need something. There's a difference. The defensiveness in Dad's voice curdled into something sharper, something that sounded almost like anger. You know what your problem is, Taylor? You've always been jealous of Sophie. Ever since you were kids, you've resented the attention we gave her. We thought you'd grow out of it, but here you are, a grown woman still keeping score like a child. The accusation hit me like a punch to the chest, but I didn't let it knock me down. Instead, something clarified in my mind, something I had been too afraid to see clearly until this exact moment. This was who they were. This was who they had always been. And no amount of silence or sacrifice on my part was ever going to change it. I'm not jealous of Sophie, I said quietly. I feel sorry for her. She's never had to stand on her own 2 feet because you've never let her. And I feel sorry for myself too because I spent my whole life trying to earn love that was never going to be equally given. Now you're just being dramatic. This is exactly why we don't include you in things, Taylor. You make everything about yourself. I actually laughed at that, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. I make everything about myself, Dad. I have spent my entire adult life making everything about everyone else. I've sent money when you asked, showed up when you called, kept my mouth shut when I should have spoken up. And the one time I finally say something about being hurt, I'm the selfish one. You are being selfish. Your mother needs medical tests and you're sitting there whining about not being invited to Christmas. Family helps, family tailor. That's what we do. Family lies to family too, apparently. That's what you do. There was a long pause, and when Dad spoke again, his voice had gone cold in a way I had never heard before. Fine. If that's how you want to be, then fine. But don't come crying to us when you're old and alone and realise you threw away your family over some petty grudge. You're being ungrateful, Taylor. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. By abandoning us in our time of need. The words were meant to wound, and part of me felt their sting. But a larger part of me, a part that had been asleep for too long, recognised them for what they were. Manipulation, control, the same tools that had kept me quiet and compliant for 36 years. And in that recognition, I found something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Clarity. Dad, I want you to really hear what I'm about to say. My voice was calm, measured, completely devoid of the anger I might have expected to feel. For years, I thought I was part of this family. I thought if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, gave in enough, eventually you would see me the way you see Sophie. But I understand now that was never going to happen. To you, I'm not a daughter. I'm a bank account with a heartbeat. That's not true, and you know it. Then, why is this the first time you've called me since Thanksgiving? Why didn't anyone ask where I was on Christmas? Why does every conversation we have end with you asking me for money? Silence. For the first time in the entire conversation, Dad had nothing to say. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I'm done, Dad. I'm done funding lies. I'm done being the invisible daughter who only matters when she's useful. I'm done pretending this family treats me fairly when every piece of evidence says otherwise. Taylor, don't do this. You're making a mistake you can't take back. No, the mistake was waiting this long to say something. I walked to my window and looked out at the dark street, at the lights in other people's apartments where other families were living their lives. Lose my number, Dad. I don't fund liars. Then I did something I had never done before in my entire life. I hung up on my father. The apartment fell silent around me and I stood there for a long time, phone in hand, waiting for the guilt to crash over me. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Lightness. The strange, terrifying freedom of finally speaking the truth. I turned off my phone and went to bed. The next morning, when I finally turned it back on the screen, showed 53 missed calls. 53 missed calls. I stared at the number on my screen, watching it climb higher as I scrolled through the notifications that had accumulated overnight. Voicemails from numbers I recognised, and some I didn't, text messages that filled my inbox so completely I had to scroll for nearly a minute to reach the end. The family I had been invisible to for years had suddenly noticed I existed, and their attention was overwhelming in the worst possible way. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat down at my kitchen table with my phone, deciding to read through everything before starting my workday. If I was going to maintain my resolve, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. What I found in those messages told me more about my family than 36 years of living with them ever had. Aunt Linda's message arrived, first on stamped at 11:30 the night before. Taylor, I just heard what happened. I cannot believe you would speak to your father that way. After everything your parents have sacrificed for you and Sophie, this is how you repay them. Family sticks together. I raised you better than this. She hadn't raised me at all, but I didn't bother pointing that out to no one but myself. Uncle Robert followed shortly after. Your dad called me very upset. I don't know what's gotten into you, but You need to apologize and make this right. Your mother is in tears. Is that what you wanted? To make your own mother cry?" Cousin Marcus, who I hadn't spoken to in over 2 years, suddenly had opinions about my character. "Wow, Taylor, I always thought you were the reasonable one in the family. Guess money really does change people. Hope you're happy being rich and alone." The messages continued in the same vein. Relatives I barely knew weighed in on a situation they understood only from my parents' perspective. Each text painted me as the villain, the selfish daughter who had turned her back on her struggling family over a petty disagreement. No one asked for my side. No one wondered if perhaps there was more to the story. They had already made up their minds. Then I reached my mother's message, and something in my chest tightened despite my determination to stay detached. "Taylor, I don't know what to say. Your father is devastated. He barely slept last night. I know you're upset about Christmas, and maybe we could have handled things better, but this is not the way to deal with it. Sophie was counting on that car to get to her new job. The position is 40 minutes away, and there's no public transportation. If she loses this opportunity because she can't get there, her whole future falls apart. Is that what you want, to destroy your sister's future because you're angry about not being invited to dinner? We raised you to be better than this. I'm begging you, Taylor. Please don't let pride ruin this family. Call your father and apologize. We can work this out like adults." I read the message 3 times, searching for any acknowledgement of what they had done wrong. Any admission that lying to me about Christmas might have been hurtful. Any recognition that asking for $37,000 after excluding me from the family celebration might seem insensitive. There was nothing. In my mother's version of events, I was simply overreacting to a minor slight throwing away family bonds over bruised feelings. The worst messages came from my father arriving in a rapid-fire sequence that suggested he had been typing furiously through the night. The first one was relatively restrained. "Taylor, we need to talk about this. Call me back." The second one less so. "I can't believe you hung up on me. In 36 years, you have never shown me such disrespect. I didn't raise you to act this way." By the 5th message, any pretense of calm had vanished entirely. "You've changed, Taylor. Ever since you got that fancy job and started making money, you think you're better than the rest of us. You look down on your family, on the people who sacrificed everything to give you a good life. Your mother and I worked ourselves to the bone to put you through school, and this is the thanks we get. A daughter who won't even help when her own mother needs medical care. You're heartless. I don't know who you've become, but it's not the daughter I raised." I set down my phone and stared out the window at the grey morning sky. The accusation that I had changed because of money was almost funny in its irony. I hadn't changed at all. I was the same person I had always been, the daughter who worked hard and kept quiet and never asked for anything. What had changed was my willingness to accept being treated as less than. My phone buzzed again, and I looked down expecting another angry text. Instead, I saw a voicemail notification from a number I hadn't heard from yet in this barrage of family fury. Sophie. I hesitated before playing it. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say. Part of me was afraid that whatever she said would somehow break through the wall I was building around my heart. In the end, curiosity won out over caution. Her voice was sharp when the message began nothing like the tearful, grateful sister I had seen in the Christmas video. "Taylor, it's me. I just heard about your conversation with Dad, and honestly, I'm disgusted. Do you have any idea what you've done? Mum and Dad gave me that car because they loved me and wanted to help me succeed. That's what parents are supposed to do. Just because you're jealous doesn't give you the right to punish everyone else. Dad asked you for help and you threw it back in his face. What kind of person does that? You've always thought you were better than me, haven't you? Always the smart one, the successful one, looking down on poor little Sophie, who can't get her life together. Well, guess what? At least I have a family that loves me. At least people actually want me around. Maybe the reason you spent Christmas alone is because nobody can stand being near you." The voicemail ended with a click. I set the phone down and took a slow, deep breath. Then Sophie called again, and this time she was ready to cross every line I had left. I answered the phone without saying anything. I just let the silence sit there waiting for Sophie to fill it with whatever she had called to say. After her voicemail, I already knew this conversation wasn't going to be pleasant, but something in me needed to hear it directly. I needed to understand exactly how my family saw me without the filter of polite pretense. "Taylor, are you there?" Sophie's voice was impatient, clipped in a way that suggested she had been working herself up to this call. "Mom and Dad told me I should reach out to you because apparently you need to hear it from me directly. You owe this family so much, Taylor. You owe us." I almost laughed. Instead, I put the phone on speaker and set it on my kitchen counter so I could pour myself another cup of coffee. If I was going to listen to this, I was going to need it. "I owe you," I repeated flatly. "Please explain to me how you figured that out." "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Mom and Dad sacrificed so much more for you when you were starting out. They helped you with college applications, they drove you to all those interview prep sessions, they supported you through everything until you got that first big job. And what did I get hand-me-downs and leftovers because by the time it was my turn, they were exhausted." I set down the coffee pot harder than I intended. "Sophie, I paid for my own college. I took out loans that I spent 10 years paying back. Mom and Dad never gave me money for school." "That's not what they told me. They said they emptied their savings to help you get started, and that's why there wasn't as much left for me. I'm just getting what's fair now. The car, the support, all of it is just evening the score." The lie was so complete, so thoroughly woven into the family narrative that I almost didn't know how to respond. My parents had told Sophie they sacrificed for me. They had convinced her that I was the one who had drained the family resources. No wonder she had always seemed to resent me. She had been raised on a story that painted me as the favoured child who took everything and left nothing behind. "Sophie, that's not true. None of that is true. I don't know why Mom and Dad told you that, but I can show you my loan statements. I can show you the bank records from when I was 22 and had negative $300 in my account while working 2 jobs to make rent." "You're lying. You always lie to make yourself look better. Mom and Dad wouldn't make something like that up." "Wouldn't they? They told me there was no money for Christmas this year. They told me the family couldn't afford to get together. And then I watched a video of everyone celebrating while you opened the keys to a brand new car." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought maybe I had gotten through to her. Then Sophie's voice came back harder than before. "That's different. They were saving specifically for me because they knew I needed it. Do you have any idea how hard my life has been? I've tried 5 times to get jobs in the last 3 years, and every single time something went wrong. The economy is bad. The job market is impossible. I went through interviews and rejections and dead ends while you sat in your fancy apartment judging me." "I never judged you, Sophie. I barely knew what was happening in your life because no one told me. Because you never asked. You never cared. You were too busy being successful to notice that your little sister was drowning." Her voice cracked slightly, and underneath the anger I heard something that sounded almost like genuine pain. "I have so much debt, Taylor. Credit cards, personal loans, money I borrowed trying to keep myself afloat while I looked for work. I didn't tell Mom and Dad because I didn't want them to worry, but it's crushing me. And the one time they do something big for me, the one time they try to give me a chance to actually succeed, you have to ruin it by making everything about you." I closed my eyes and pressed my palm against my forehead. Part of me wanted to feel sympathy for her. She was clearly struggling, clearly overwhelmed, clearly operating on a version of reality that had been carefully constructed by our parents to keep her dependent and me distant. But the part of me that had spent Christmas alone, that had been called heartless and selfish and ungrateful for simply pointing out the truth, couldn't find it in myself to soften. Sophie, I'm sorry you're struggling. I genuinely am. But none of that is my fault, and none of it justifies lying to me or excluding me from the family. There you go again, making it about yourself. People like you who only care about money don't deserve family. The words came out sharp and certain, like she had been thinking them for years and was finally saying them out loud. You know what Mum said after you hung up on Dad? She said she wasn't surprised. She said you've always been cold. That's why they didn't invite you to Christmas. They knew you'd just sit in the corner judging everyone and making people uncomfortable. They were trying to protect the rest of us from your negativity. The accusation hung in the air between us, and I understood finally and completely that this wasn't just about Sophie. This was about everything my parents had told her, every narrative they had constructed to justify their favoritism, every lie they had wrapped around our family until the truth was buried so deep no one could find it anymore. And in that moment, as my sister's words echoed in my ears, an idea formed in my mind. Not revenge exactly, but something close to it. Something I never thought I would act on. But maybe it was time to stop being the daughter who kept quiet. After Sophie hung up on me, I sat in the silence of my apartment for a long time. The accusations she had thrown at me echoed in my mind, mixing with my father's angry texts and my mother's guilt-laden pleas. They all painted the same picture of me as the cold, selfish daughter who had abandoned her family when they needed her most. But there was another picture, one I had been quietly assembling for months, and tonight felt like the right time to look at it again. I moved to my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the spreadsheet I had created 8 months earlier when something had first started to feel wrong. At the time, I had dismissed my suspicions as paranoia, the result of too many years of feeling overlooked. But numbers don't lie, and the numbers I had collected told a story my family never wanted me to see. For years, I had been sending money to my parents whenever they asked. A few hundred here for an unexpected car repair. 1,000 there for property taxes they said they couldn't cover. 5,000 once when Dad claimed he needed emergency dental work. Each request came with the same assurances we hate to ask, we'll pay you back when we can. You're such a good daughter for helping out. I never asked for repayment because I never expected it. I was helping my family and that was enough. But 8 months ago, something changed. Mum had accidentally sent me a bank statement meant for Dad attached to an email about something unrelated. At first, I thought it was for their regular checking account, the one I knew had barely enough to cover monthly bills. Then, I noticed the account number was different, and the balance made my breath catch in my throat. $118,000. I had stared at that number for a full minute, certain there had been some mistake. My parents lived modestly. They complained constantly about money. They had asked me for help just 2 months before that statement arrived, claiming they were short on the mortgage payment. How could they possibly have over $100,000 sitting in a savings account? That night I had done something I'm not proud of. Using login credentials Mum had shared with me years ago when she needed help, paying a bill online, I accessed their banking portal and found the account myself. What I discovered made me feel like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The account had been opened 7 years earlier, shortly after I received my first major promotion. The initial deposit was $1,500, the exact amount I had sent them that month, to help with what Dad called medical expenses. From there, the deposits continued in a pattern I recognized immediately. Every time I sent money, a nearly identical amount appeared in this savings account within days. They weren't using my help to cover emergencies. They were funneling it into a separate fund and pretending it didn't exist. I spent weeks going through the records, matching my own bank transfers to their deposits. The correlation was undeniable. Over 7 years, I had sent my parents approximately $130,000 in various amounts for various stated emergencies. Of that total, they had quietly redirected $127,000 into this savings account. The fund they had proudly announced to the family, the one Dad credited in his Christmas speech as 7 years of dedicated saving, was built almost entirely on money I had given them. They weren't saving for Sophie's future. They were taking from my present and repackaging it as their own generosity. When I first discovered all of this 8 months ago, my immediate impulse was to confront them. I wanted to call my father and demand an explanation, to ask my mother how she could accept money for fake emergencies while squirreling it away for a car for Sophie. But something held me back. Maybe it was the decades of conditioning that told me to keep quiet. Maybe it was the small, desperate hope that there was an explanation I hadn't considered. So instead of confronting them, I simply stopped sending money. I stopped answering the requests, stopped automatically covering the emergencies that seemed to arise with suspicious regularity. I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to know if they would come clean when the funds stopped flowing, if they would finally acknowledge what they had been doing. They didn't. Instead, they just complained more loudly about being broke, about struggling to make ends meet, about the sacrifices they were making for Sophie. And then Christmas came, and they told me there was no money for a family gathering while they planned a celebration funded by my own contributions. I pulled up the spreadsheet now and added the final pieces of information I had gathered since Christmas. The car Sophie received was valued at approximately $32,000. Combined with the cost of hosting 15 family members for dinner decorations and travel reimbursements for relatives who came from out of state, my parents had spent somewhere between $35,000 and $40,000 on a Christmas I wasn't invited to attend. And 3 days later, Dad had called asking for $37,000 more. Not because they were broke, but because they had spent my money and wanted me to replenish the fund so they could continue pretending it was theirs. I closed the spreadsheet and opened my desk drawer, pulling out a folder I had been preparing for months. Inside were printed statements, transfer records, timestamps, and calculations. Everything I would need to prove exactly where that fund had come from. I had gathered it all, hoping I would never need to use it, hoping my family would somehow prove me wrong. They hadn't. And now, after everything they had said and done, after years of lies and manipulation, and treating me as nothing more than a source of income, I was done waiting for them to change. I opened my email and began typing. The message I was about to send would reach every member of my extended family, every aunt and uncle and cousin who had texted me, accusations over the past 2 days. It was time for everyone to see the truth. The email took me 3 hours to write, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted every word to be precise, every sentence carefully constructed, to leave no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't a message fired off in anger. This was a document, a formal declaration that I had thought about for months and was only now ready to send. I addressed it to my parents first, then added my extended family in the recipient's line. Aunt Linda, Uncle Robert, Cousin Marcus, and every other relative who had sent me accusatory messages over the past 2 days. They had all been so quick to judge me based on my parents' version of events. Now they would have the opportunity to see the complete picture. The subject line read simply, "Financial support, termination, and documentation." "Dear family," I began, "I am writing to inform you of a decision I have made regarding my financial relationship with Mum and Dad. Effective immediately, I will no longer be providing any monetary support covering any expenses or responding to any requests for financial assistance. This decision is final and not open for negotiation." I paused, reading the words back to myself. They felt foreign, like something a stranger would write. For so long, I had been the daughter who said yes to everything, who absorbed every request without complaint. But that daughter had been taken advantage of, and it was time for her to step aside. Over the past 7 years, I continued, I have provided substantial financial assistance to our parents in response to numerous stated emergencies and hardships. I have always given willingly and never asked for repayment, believing that I was helping family members who were genuinely struggling. Recent events have made it clear that this belief was misguided. The next section was the hardest to write, not because I doubted the facts, but because putting them into words made the betrayal feel more real. Attached to this email, you will find a detailed spreadsheet documenting every payment I have made to Mum and Dad since I began my career. The total sum amounts to approximately $130,000 given over 7 years in varying amounts for stated purposes, including medical bills, car repairs, mortgage shortfalls, utility emergencies, and other claimed necessities. I have also included dates transfer records and the original text messages requesting these funds. I opened the attachment one more time to review it. The spreadsheet was organised chronologically, each row containing a date, an amount, the stated reason for the request, and a reference to the corresponding bank transfer. Seeing it laid out so clearly was almost overwhelming. $1,500 in January of my first year for Dad's dental work, $3,000 in March for an emergency room visit that insurance supposedly didn't cover, $800 in June for car repairs. The requests came steadily, sometimes monthly, sometimes with gaps of a few weeks, but always with the same tone of desperate need and grateful appreciation. I returned to the email and continued typing. What I did not know until recently was that the vast majority of these funds were not being used for the stated emergencies. Instead, they were being deposited into a separate savings account that Mum and Dad have been building for Sophie. The fund that was celebrated at this year's Christmas gathering, the one Dad described as 7 years of dedicated saving, was accumulated almost entirely from money I provided under false pretenses. I let that statement sit for a moment before moving on. I want to be clear about what I am saying. I was told repeatedly that our parents were struggling financially. I was asked for help to cover genuine hardships. I gave that help freely and without question. And all the while, my contributions were being redirected into a fund that I was never told about, for a purpose I was never consulted on, while I was simultaneously excluded from family gatherings because of claimed financial constraints. The next paragraph addressed my extended family directly. To those who have contacted me over the past few days, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and heartless, I hope this documentation provides some context for my decision. I have not abandoned my family. I have simply stopped being deceived by them. If you choose to continue believing their narrative despite the evidence I am providing, that is your choice. But I will not apologise for refusing to fund lies. I copied my personal lawyer on the email as I had planned. She had been advising me since I first discovered the hidden account 8 months ago, helping me understand my options and prepare for this moment. Having her included in the correspondence wasn't a threat exactly, but it was a statement. This was serious. I was serious. And I had documentation to support every claim I was making. The final paragraph was brief. I wish everyone well. I hope that in time we can rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty rather than financial dependency. But that rebuilding will not include any further monetary support from me. Please do not contact me requesting funds. Such requests will not be answered. I signed my name and attached the spreadsheet, then sat staring at the send button for a long time. Once I clicked it, there would be no taking it back. My family would see everything. They would know that I knew. The carefully constructed narrative my parents had maintained for years would collapse under the weight of documented truth. I clicked send. The response was almost immediate. Within 20 minutes, my phone began ringing. Dad's name appeared on the screen, then Mum's, then Dad's again. I watched the calls come in without answering, letting each one roll to voicemail. Text messages followed dozens of them, the notification sounds blending into a continuous chime of panic. Taylor, what have you done? Call me immediately. We need to talk. You had no right to send that to the whole family. This is a private matter. How dare you? I read each message as it arrived, feeling something unexpected wash over me. Not guilt, not regret, liberation. For the first time in years, I had spoken the truth, and nothing they could say would change the facts I had presented. The numbers were clear, the evidence was irrefutable, and I was finally free of the obligation to pretend I didn't see what they had been doing. I turned off my phone and went to bed sleeping more soundly than I had in months. The next morning, a knock at my door woke me earlier than I expected. I assumed it was a delivery, perhaps a package I had forgotten about. But when I opened the door, I found myself face to face with someone I never expected to see standing in my hallway. Margaret Chen stood in my doorway, her silver hair neatly pinned back, and a small plate of homemade cookies in her weathered hands. She was 83 years old, had lived in the apartment next to mine for the past 5 years, and in all that time we had never exchanged more than polite greetings in the hallway. She kept to herself, and I respected that boundary. So finding her at my door on this particular morning, after the chaos of the past few days, was the last thing I expected. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who had rehearsed what she wanted to say. "I've been listening through these thin walls, and I know you've been going through something difficult. I made these yesterday and thought maybe you could use a friendly face." I accepted the cookies more out of surprise than hunger, and stepped aside to let her in. She moved slowly, settling into my couch with the careful movements of someone whose joints no longer cooperated the way they once did. I made us both tea, grateful for the simple task that gave my hands something to do, and sat across from her wondering what had prompted this unexpected visit. "I'm not here just because of the cookies," Margaret admitted once we were both settled. "There's something I've been keeping to myself for a long time, and after hearing what's been happening with your family, I think maybe you need to know." I set down my cup. "What do you mean?" Margaret's eyes, still sharp despite her age, met mine with something like sympathy. "Your grandmother and I were friends, Taylor. Rose and I grew up on the same street, went to the same church, stayed in touch even after life took us in different directions. She used to tell me things about your family that worried her deeply." The mention of Grandma Rose made my chest tighten. She had been gone for 13 years now, but sometimes the grief still caught me off guard. "You knew my grandmother." "Knew her well. We wrote letters to each other for decades, and when she got sick, I visited her as often as I could. During one of those visits, she told me something she said she'd never shared with anyone else." Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "She said she was worried your parents were making a terrible mistake. She told me they were loving you less because you needed them less, and that one day it would break your heart." I felt the words land somewhere deep in my chest, confirming what I had suspected for so long, but never heard spoken aloud by anyone outside my own mind. She saw it too. She saw it from the very beginning. She tried to talk to your father about it more than once, but he always dismissed her concerns, told her she was imagining things, that he loved both his daughters equally. Rose didn't believe him, but she also knew that pushing too hard would only make him defensive. Margaret shook her head slowly. "She used to say that your father confused loving someone with needing them. Because Sophie always seemed to need rescuing, he felt useful. You were too capable, too independent, and he didn't know what to do with a child who could stand on her own." I thought about my grandmother's words on her porch all those years ago, the ones I had carried with me ever since. Strength shouldn't mean loneliness. She had been trying to warn me even then. "There's more," Margaret continued, her hands folded in her lap. "Something that happened when you were about 16. Do you remember applying for a scholarship program through your school, a science and mathematics academy, very prestigious, full funding for the top students in the state?" The memory surfaced slowly, buried under years of other disappointments. "I remember applying. I got to the final round of interviews, and then I was told I didn't get it. My parents said another student was chosen instead." Margaret's expression shifted to something pained. "You weren't rejected, Taylor. You were accepted. The academy sent a letter to your parents congratulating them on your selection. It was a full scholarship room, And board included an opportunity that could have changed the entire direction of your education. What? The word came out barely above a whisper. Your parents turned it down. They never told you because they didn't want you to know. Rose found out because the academy director was a friend of a friend, and she contacted your grandmother wondering why such a promising student had withdrawn at the last minute. Margaret reached over and placed her hand gently on mine. Your mother told the director that accepting the scholarship would make Sophie feel inferior. She said it wasn't fair to elevate one daughter while the other was already struggling in school. She asked them to give the spot to someone else. I couldn't speak. My entire body had gone still processing information that rewrote a piece of my history I thought I understood. I had spent years believing I simply wasn't good enough for that program. I had used that rejection as motivation to work harder, to prove myself in other ways, never knowing that the opportunity had been mine all along and had been taken from me without my knowledge or consent. Rose was devastated when she found out, Margaret continued. She confronted your parents about it, but they insisted they were doing the right thing for the family. They said keeping the peace between you and Sophie was more important than any scholarship. Rose never forgave them for it, and she never stopped worrying about what other opportunities they might have cost you. I pulled my hand back, needing space to absorb what I was hearing. Why are you telling me this now, after all these years? Because there's one more thing, and it connects to what's happening now. Margaret's voice dropped slightly. About 10 years ago, your parents came to me asking for a loan. They said they were behind on their mortgage and needed help to avoid losing the house. I gave them $8,000 because I cared about Rose and didn't want to see her son lose his home. They promised to pay me back within a year. I already knew where this was going, but I needed to hear her say it. They never paid me directly. But about 3 years after that loan, your mother called to tell me the debt was settled. She said you had sent them money to cover some bills, and they were using part of it to repay what they owed me. Margaret met my eyes with gentle understanding. You paid back a loan you never knew existed, Taylor. A loan they took out in secret and repaid using your generosity without ever telling you the truth. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below without really seeing it. Everything Margaret had told me was clicking into place, filling gaps in a story I had been trying to understand my entire life. The scholarship I never got. The loan I unknowingly repaid. The decades of being quietly diminished so that Sophie could feel adequate by comparison. This pattern had been in motion since before I could remember. My parents had been choosing Sophie over me since I was a teenager, maybe longer, sabotaging my opportunities and using my success to fund their favoritism. And they had done it so carefully, so quietly, that I had never suspected the full depth of their deception. Margaret's words echoed in my mind as I stared out at the grey morning sky. It was time to break this pattern, once and for all. After Margaret left, I sat alone in my apartment for a long time, letting everything she had told me settle into my understanding of my own life. The scholarship I never knew I had earned. The loan I had unknowingly repaid. The decades of quiet sabotage that had shaped my relationship with my family in ways I was only now beginning to comprehend. Each revelation added another layer to the betrayal, making it clear that what had happened at Christmas was not an isolated incident, but the latest chapter in a very long story. I could have wallowed in that pain. A younger version of me might have done exactly that, retreating into sadness and wondering what I had done to deserve such treatment. But I wasn't that person anymore. Margaret's visit had crystallized something inside me, transforming hurt into determination. If my family had been building a case against me for decades, then it was time for me to build one of my own. I spent the next 3 days doing nothing but organizing evidence. I took time off work, cleared my schedule, and devoted myself entirely to the task of documenting everything my family had taken from me under false pretenses. It was tedious work requiring me to dig through years of bank statements, email archives and text message histories, but with each document I uncovered, I felt my resolve strengthen. The first category I created was for my father's debts. Every request he had made over the years for help with his car, his tools, his medical appointments, his unexpected emergencies went into this folder. I printed out the text messages where he had asked for money, the bank transfers showing when and how much I had sent, and the dates that corresponded with deposits into the hidden savings account. The total for Dad alone came to over $40,000 across 7 years. The second category was for my mother's expenses. She had always been more subtle in her requests, framing them as household necessities rather than personal needs. Help with the grocery budget during a tough month. Contributions to utility bills that had supposedly spiked during a cold winter. Small amounts here and there that added up to nearly $30,000 over time. Each one had been presented as a temporary hardship, a brief struggle that would pass as soon as things stabilised. Things never stabilised and the requests never stopped. The third category was the largest and most painful to compile. Sophie's emergencies. Every time my sister had supposedly needed help that my parents couldn't provide, they had turned to me. Money for her car repairs before they bought her a new one. Funds to cover rent when she was between jobs. Contributions to credit card bills that had gotten out of control. The requests always came through my parents, framed as desperate situations that required immediate action. I had given over $50,000 specifically designated for Sophie's needs, never knowing that most of it was being rerouted into the fund that would eventually buy her a brand new SUV. The fourth and final category was the most damaging: payments made under false pretenses. This folder contained every instance where my parents had asked for money, citing a specific emergency that I could now prove had never existed. The dental work Dad claimed he needed, for which I had sent $1,500, had actually been covered by his insurance. The emergency room visit that supposedly cost $3,000 had been a routine checkup. The mortgage shortfalls, the utility crises, the car repairs that couldn't wait, had all been fabricated or exaggerated to extract money that went directly into the hidden account. With everything organised, I called my lawyer. Jennifer had been advising me since I first discovered the secret savings account 8 months earlier, and she had encouraged me to document everything thoroughly before taking any action. Now it was time to discuss what my options actually were. "You've done excellent work," she said after reviewing the files I had sent her. "This documentation is comprehensive and well organised. If it ever came to a legal dispute, you would have a very strong position." "What kind of legal dispute are we talking about?" I asked. "Can I actually recover any of this money?" "Potentially, yes. What your parents did could be classified as fraud or unjust enrichment. They solicited funds under false pretenses and used them for purposes other than what was stated. However, pursuing that in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. It might also be difficult to prove that you didn't give the money as gifts." I had expected as much. "What about the tax implications I've given them? Well over $100,000 in 7 years. Jennifer's tone became more serious. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss with you. Under IRS regulations, any gift over $15,000 per year to a single recipient needs to be reported. The giver files a gift tax return. And while no tax is typically owed until you exceed the lifetime exemption, the reporting requirement still exists." "I never filed any gift tax returns," I said. "I didn't even know I was supposed to." "Technically, the responsibility to report falls on the giver, which is you. However, given the circumstances, this situation is more complicated. Your parents solicited these funds as loans or emergency assistance, not as gifts. You gave money, expecting it to be used for stated purposes. The fact that they redirected it into savings without your knowledge changes the nature of the transaction." I processed this information slowly. "So what does that mean for them?" "If the IRS were to look into their finances and discover that they received over $100,000 from you that was never properly reported, they could face penalties and interest. Depending on how the transactions were characterized, there could also be questions about unreported income. Your parents took money under false pretenses, didn't report it, and didn't use it for the purposes stated. That's a potential audit nightmare. I hadn't intended to use the IRS as leverage. My goal wasn't to destroy my family financially or get them into legal trouble. But knowing that their deception had created vulnerabilities gave me something I hadn't had before: bargaining power. I'm not going to report them, I told Jennifer, but I want them to know what they've done and what the consequences could be. I want them to understand that they can't keep treating me like a bank account and expecting no accountability. That's your choice, Jennifer said. Just make sure that whatever confrontation you have is documented. Keep records of any admissions they make, and be prepared for them to react badly when they realize how much evidence you've collected. After the call ended, I sat at my desk surrounded by folders and printouts, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about 36 years of being overlooked, undervalued, and taken for granted. It was about a scholarship I never knew I had earned and a loan I never knew I had repaid. It was about Christmas dinners I wasn't invited to and emergencies that never existed. I picked up my phone and typed a message to my parents. The words were simple, direct, and left no room for evasion. Family meeting this weekend. I'll bring the receipts. The text from Sophie arrived 2 days before the family meeting while I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on a quarterly report that refused to hold my attention. My phone buzzed with her name on the screen and I almost ignored it. After everything she had said during our last conversation, after calling me cold and selfish and accusing me of not deserving family, I had no interest in hearing more of the same. But something made me look anyway, and what I found was nothing like what I expected. Taylor, please, I need to talk to you before this weekend. There's something I haven't told anyone, and I'm begging you not to mention it at the meeting. Mom and Dad don't know about my credit card debt. Please don't tell them. I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it twice to make sure I understood. Sophie had debt that our parents didn't know about. The same parents who had spent 7 years building a fund specifically to help her. The same parents who claimed to know everything about her struggles and needs. This didn't match the story I had been told, the narrative of a family united in their support of the younger daughter, while the older one was left to fend for herself. I typed back a simple response. What debt? The reply came quickly, as if Sophie had been waiting anxiously for me to respond. Can I call you? I don't want to put this in writing. Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me was still angry enough to refuse any communication that might soften my resolve before the confrontation I had been preparing for. But curiosity won out over caution, and I told her to call. Her voice when she answered was nothing like the sharp, accusatory tone she had used days earlier. She sounded small, frightened, like the little sister I remembered from childhood before everything between us became complicated by our parents' favoritism. I owe $43,000, she said without any preamble. Credit cards mostly, some personal loans. I've been hiding it for almost 3 years. The number hit me harder than I expected. $43,000 was more than a year's salary for many people, a crushing weight that could take decades to escape. How did you accumulate that much debt? Training courses, certifications, programs that were supposed to help me build a real career? Sophie's voice cracked slightly. I kept signing up for things because I thought if I just had the right qualification, the right credential, someone would finally hire me for a job that paid enough to live on. But every course cost money and I didn't have any, so I put it on credit cards thinking I would pay it off once I got a good job. And the jobs never came. I applied for 5 different positions over the past 2 years. Real jobs ones that could have been careers. I got to the interview stage for 3 of them, and every single time they asked about my experience and I had nothing to show. No internships, no entry-level work, no history of actually doing the kind of work I was trying to get hired for. I had certificates and degrees and absolutely nothing practical to back them up. I leaned back in my chair, processing what she was telling me. Why didn't you get that experience, internships, entry-level positions, anything to build a foundation? Because Mum and Dad always said I didn't need to take low-paying work. They said it was beneath me that I should wait for something better, that struggling wasn't necessary, when they could help support me. Sophie let out a bitter laugh. Every time I tried to take a job that paid minimum wage or required me to start at the bottom, they talked me out of it. They said I was too smart for that, too special, that I deserved better than working retail or answering phones. The irony was almost painful. Our parents had protected Sophie from every struggle, every hardship, every opportunity to build the resilience and experience that employers actually valued. They had convinced her she was too good for entry-level work, while simultaneously ensuring she would never qualify for anything else. And, in doing so, they had created exactly the failure they claimed to be protecting her from. So you took on debt to try to compensate, I said, to buy credentials that would make up for the experience you never got. I thought it would work. I thought if I just had enough certifications, no one would care that I'd never actually done the work. But it doesn't work that way. Employers want to see that you've done the job before, not that you've paid for classes about how to do it. Sophie's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And now, I'm drowning. The minimum payments alone are more than I can afford, and the interest keeps adding up, and I can't tell Mum and Dad because they think the car is going to fix everything. The car, I repeated flatly. They're so proud of themselves for giving it to me. They keep saying how now I can get to interviews, now I can take jobs further from home. Now everything is going to fall into place. But Taylor, I can barely afford the insurance. I'm going to lose it eventually anyway, because I can't keep up with the payments on everything else. The car isn't saving me. It's just another thing I'm going to fail at. I sat in silence for a long moment, letting Sophie's words settle over me. For days, I had been preparing for a confrontation based on the assumption that my sister was complicit in our parents' deception, that she had knowingly benefited from their lies while I was left in the cold. But what I was hearing now painted a different picture entirely. Sophie wasn't the villain of this story. She was another casualty of our parents' dysfunction, shaped by the same forces that had pushed me toward independence while pulling her toward helplessness. They had loved her so much that they had crippled her, protected her so thoroughly that she had never learned how to stand on her own. And now she was 32 years old with $43,000 in debt, a car she couldn't afford, and absolutely no foundation to build a life on. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally. "After everything you said to me, why are you asking for my help now?" "Because I don't have anyone else." Sophie's voice broke completely. "Mum and Dad think I'm fine. They think the car solved everything. If they find out about the debt, it will destroy them. They'll blame themselves and try to fix it, and probably go into debt themselves trying to bail me out. I can't let that happen. I'm supposed to be the one they helped. I'm supposed to be the success story." I understood then, with a clarity that cut through all my anger, that my sister had been carrying her own impossible burden, different from mine but equally crushing. She had been trapped by love that demanded she remain helpless, while I had been trapped by neglect that demanded I remain strong. We were both prisoners of the same dysfunctional system. But understanding didn't change what needed to happen next. I arrived at my parents' house on Saturday afternoon with a leather folder tucked under my arm and a calm I had practiced for days. The drive had taken 45 minutes and I had spent every one of them breathing slowly and reminding myself that this confrontation wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about setting boundaries. It was about finally being seen for who I was rather than what I could provide. Mum opened the door before I could knock her face tight with anxiety. She looked like she hadn't slept well in days, and part of me felt a flicker of sympathy before I reminded myself why I was there. Behind her, I could see Dad sitting in his usual armchair, his posture rigid and his expression guarded. Sophie was on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed, refusing to meet my gaze. They had gathered as I had requested. Now it was time to show them what I had gathered. I sat in the chair across from my parents and placed the folder on the coffee table between us. No one spoke. The tension in the room was thick enough to taste, and I let it build for a moment before opening the folder and removing the first set of documents. I want to start by saying that I'm not here to yell or make accusations. I began keeping my voice steady and measured. I'm here to share information and establish some boundaries moving forward. I've organised everything chronologically so we can go through it together. I handed the first stack of papers to my father. These are bank statements showing every transfer I've made to you and Mum over the past 7 years. The highlighted entries are the ones that correspond to specific requests you made for financial help. Emergency dental work, medical bills, mortgage shortfalls, car repairs. The total comes to approximately $130,000. Dad took the papers but didn't look at them. His eyes stayed fixed on my face, searching for something, though I couldn't tell what. Mum reached over and took the stack from him, her hands trembling slightly as she began flipping through the pages. The second section, I continued pulling out another set of documents, is a comparison between the dates I sent you money and the deposits made into a savings account you opened 7 years ago, an account you never told me about. Mum's face went pale. Dad's jaw tightened. I know about the fund, I said quietly. I've known for 8 months. I found out by accident when Mum forwarded me a bank statement that was meant for Dad. At first, I thought there must be some explanation. Maybe you had an emergency fund I didn't know about, or maybe the money I sent really was being used for the things you claimed, and this was separate. So I waited. I watched. I stopped sending money to see what would happen. Taylor, Mum started, her voice shaking. Please, let me finish. I held up my hand gently but firmly. What I found was that almost every dollar I sent you over 7 years went directly into that savings account. The emergencies you described, the hardships you claimed to be facing, either didn't exist or were greatly exaggerated. You weren't struggling. You were collecting. And the fund you built, the one Dad proudly announced at Christmas, as 7 years of dedicated saving, was built almost entirely from money I gave you under false pretenses. The silence that followed was absolute. Sophie stared at the floor. Mum had tears streaming down her cheeks. Dad's face had gone from guarded to ashen, the colour draining as the weight of what I was saying settled over him. $127,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air. That's how much of my money ended up in that account. That's how much you took from me while telling me you couldn't afford to have me at Christmas dinner. We never meant, Mum began, then stopped, unable to find words to complete the sentence. I believe that you didn't mean to hurt me, I said. I believe that somewhere in your minds you justified this by telling yourselves it was for Sophie, that you were building something for her future, that the ends justified the means. But the means involved lying to me for 7 years. The means involved taking my money under false pretenses and then excluding me from the very celebrations it funded. Dad finally spoke, his voice rough. We were going to tell you eventually. We were going to pay you back. When? How? I shook my head slowly. You just asked me for $37,000 more dollars. If I had given it to you, would you have told me then? Or would it have gone into the same fund building toward the next gift for Sophie, while I was kept in the dark? Neither of them answered. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones my lawyer had helped me prepare. I'm not here to destroy this family. I'm not going to sue you or report you to anyone, but I need you to understand that what you did has consequences. My lawyer has informed me that gifts over $15,000 per year should have been reported to the IRS. Neither of us did that. If anyone ever looks closely at your finances, the amount of unreported transfers between us could raise serious questions. Mum let out a small sound of distress. Dad's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. I'm telling you this not as a threat, but as information. You need to understand the position you've put yourself in and me in by handling money this way. Moving forward, I will not be sending any more financial support. Not for emergencies, not for bills, not for anything. You will pay your own way from now on. And if that means making difficult choices, then those are choices you'll have to make. I closed the folder and folded my hands over it, looking at each of my family members in turn. Sophie, who still wouldn't meet my eyes. Mum, who was openly weeping now. Dad, whose expression had shifted from defensive to something I had never seen on his face before. Defeat. I love you, I said finally. Despite everything, I love all of you. But I've been funding a lie for 7 years and that ends today. Whether we can rebuild trust depends entirely on what happens next. I'm willing to try, but only if you're willing to be honest with me from now on. Completely honest about everything. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one seemed to know what to say or do next. The weight of my words pressed down on all of us, heavy with years of unspoken pain and unacknowledged betrayal. Then Dad did something I had never seen him do in my entire life. He broke down in tears. Deep, racking sobs that shook his whole body as he buried his face in his hands. Mum reached for him instinctively, but he pulled away, and when he finally looked up at me, his face was raw with an emotion I couldn't immediately name. I failed you, he said, his voice broken. I've been failing you since you were a little girl, and I didn't even see it until right now. I had never seen my father cry. Not when his own mother passed away, not at funerals or weddings or any of the moments that typically break people open. He was the kind of man who prided himself on stoicism, on being the steady rock that held the family together. But now, sitting in his armchair with tears running down his weathered face, he looked like a completely different person. Smaller, somehow. Broken in ways I hadn't known he could break. Mum reached for him again, and this time he didn't pull away. She placed her hand on his arm, but her eyes were on me, filled with something that looked like fear. Fear of what I might say next, perhaps, or fear of what Dad was about to reveal. There's something I never told you, Dad said, his voice thick and unsteady. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was too ashamed. I waited, saying nothing. The folder of documents still sat on the coffee table between us, but it no longer felt as important as it had moments before. Whatever was coming next had been buried for a long time, and I could feel its weight pressing against the air in the room. Before your grandmother died, Dad continued, she called me to her bedside. You were there that day, do you remember? You were sitting in the hallway, reading a book while I went in to say goodbye. I remembered. I had been 23, fresh out of college, trying to be strong for everyone else while my heart was breaking. Grandma Rose had been my anchor in a family that often felt like it was spinning around me, without ever quite including me. Losing her had felt like losing the only person who truly saw me. She knew she didn't have long. Dad wiped at his face with the back of his hand, the gesture rough and clumsy. And she wanted to make me promise something. She made me swear on her deathbed that I would protect you, Taylor, not Sophie. You. The words landed like a physical blow. I had always assumed that Grandma Rose worried about Sophie the way everyone else did, that her concern was distributed equally between her granddaughters. Learning that her final words had been specifically about me changed something fundamental in my understanding of my own history. She said to me, Dad continued, his voice cracking, protect Taylor's strength. Don't exploit it. Make sure she knows she's loved, not just needed. Those were her exact words. I can still hear her voice saying them. Mum let out a small sob. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the fragile thread of honesty that had finally begun to unspool. I promised her. I swore on everything I had that I would do right by you. Dad's face contorted with fresh anguish. And then she died and I went back to my life and I completely failed to keep my word. Why? The question came out of me before I could stop it raw and plaintive in a way I hadn't intended. Dad looked at me, then really looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never noticed before. Guilt. It had been there all along, hiding behind the favoritism and the excuses and the endless focus on Sophie. He had been running from it for 13 years. because I convinced myself that by focusing on Sophie, I was helping her become independent. I told myself that you were already strong, already capable, that you didn't need me the way she did. And every time I helped her instead of you, I rationalized it by saying I was preventing her from becoming too independent, too isolated, too much like... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Too much like me, I finished for him. Dad nodded miserably. I didn't see what I was really doing. I didn't see that by helping Sophie with everything I was making her helpless. And by ignoring you, I was proving my mother right. I was exploiting your strength instead of protecting it. I was treating you like you were needed, not loved. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of years of accumulated pain. I thought about all the times I had wondered what I had done wrong, why my father seemed to look right through me while showering Sophie with attention. I had blamed myself for being too successful, too independent, too capable of handling things on my own. Now I understood that my father had blamed himself too, but his shame had driven him deeper into the behaviour rather than away from it. Every time I saw you, Dad said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, I saw my failure. I saw my mother's face on her deathbed, making me promise to do better. And instead of fixing it, instead of making things right, I just avoided you. I told myself you didn't need me anyway, that you were fine on your own, that focusing on Sophie was more important because she was the one who struggled. And the money, I asked quietly. The fund you built from what I sent you. Dad's face crumpled again. I convinced myself it was different, that you were giving willingly, that it wasn't the same as taking from you. But it was, wasn't it? Every time you sent money, because I claimed we were struggling, I was exploiting your strength exactly the way my mother warned me not to. Mum spoke for the first time since Dad had begun his confession. We both were Taylor. I went along with it because it was easier than confronting the truth. I told myself the same lies your father told himself. That you were fine. That Sophie needed more. That everything would balance out eventually. I looked at my mother, seeing her clearly, perhaps for the first time. She wasn't the innocent bystander I had sometimes imagined her to be. She had been a willing participant in the system that had hurt me, choosing the path of least resistance over the harder work of treating her daughters fairly. I broke my promise to my mother, Dad said, his voice raw with shame. And I broke my daughter's heart. I've been so ashamed that I couldn't even look at you without seeing my failure staring back at me. That's why I avoided you. That's why I let the distance grow. Every time I saw your success, your independence, your strength, I felt like a fraud, like I had stolen something from you and gotten away with it. The room fell into heavy silence. Mum was crying quietly now, her hand still on Dad's arm. I sat motionless in my chair, processing the flood of revelations that had just reshaped my understanding of my entire childhood. Grandma Rose had seen what was coming. She had tried to prevent it, and Dad had carried the guilt of his broken promise for 13 years, letting it fester into the very behaviour she had warned him against. But through all of this, Sophie had been silent. She hadn't said a word since I arrived, hadn't defended our parents or attacked me or done anything except stare at the floor with tears running down her face. Until suddenly she stood up. Sophie stood in the middle of our parents' living room, her whole body trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Tears were streaming down her face, but she wasn't trying to hide them or wipe them away. She just stood there, exposed and raw, looking at each of us in turn, before her gaze finally landed on me. I've always known, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. From the time I was old enough to understand anything, I've known that Taylor was better than me at everything. The words hung in the air, unexpected and jarring. This wasn't the Sophie who had called me selfish and cold. This wasn't the sister who had accused me of not deserving family. This was someone I had never met before, someone who had been hiding beneath the surface of the person I thought I knew. School was easy for you, Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength, even as it shook. Sports were easy for you. Making friends, getting jobs, building a life, all of it just came naturally to you. And I watched from the sidelines, trying so hard to be good at something, anything, and failing over and over again. Mum started to speak, but Sophie held up her hand sharply. No, you don't get to comfort me right now. You've been comforting me my entire life, and look where it got us. I watched my sister transform before my eyes, the mask of entitlement and resentment falling away to reveal something far more painful underneath. She had been drowning in my shadow, and I had never even noticed because I was too busy trying to survive my own invisibility. Every time I tried to do something on my own, Sophie said, every time I took a step toward being independent, you stopped me. Remember when I wanted to get a job at the coffee shop during high school? You said I didn't need to work, that I should focus on my studies. Remember when I tried to move into an apartment with friends after graduation? You talked me out of it, said it was too risky that I should stay home where it was safe. Dad opened his mouth, but Sophie cut him off too. And every single time you said the same thing. You don't need to struggle like Taylor did. Those exact words, over and over. Like struggling was something shameful, something to be avoided, when really it was the thing that made Taylor who she is. I felt something shift in my chest. A complicated tangle of emotions I couldn't quite name. Anger was still there, but it was making room for something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. I started creating problems, Sophie admitted, her voice dropping with shame. When I realised that the only time anyone paid attention to me was when I was failing or struggling, I started making sure there was always something wrong. A crisis at school, drama with friends, emergencies that needed solving. Because at least when I was broken, I felt important. At least when I needed rescuing, someone cared. Mum let out a strangled sound. Dad's face had gone grey. Do you have any idea what that does to a person? Sophie asked, looking directly at our parents now. Do you know what it's like to feel like you're only worth something when you're falling apart? I've spent 32 years believing that the only way to matter is to need help. And now I'm so good at needing help that I don't know how to do anything else. I thought about the conversation we'd had on the phone about her $43,000 in debt and her failed attempts at building a career. She had been trying in her own way to break free of the cage our parents had built around her. But every time she tried to fly, the cage got a little smaller, the bars a little closer together. You made me weak, Sophie said, her voice cracking on the words. You loved me so much that you made me completely helpless. Every problem I had, you solved it. Every failure I experienced, you cushioned it. Every time I should have struggled and learned and grown, you stepped in and made sure I never had to feel uncomfortable for more than a minute. She turned to me then, and I saw something in her eyes I had never expected to see. Not jealousy, not resentment, grief. And you, she said to me, her voice softening, they made you strong by denying you the love you deserved. Every time they ignored you, every time they chose me over you, every time they made you figure things out on your own, they were accidentally teaching you how to survive. You learned how to stand on your own feet because you had no other choice, and I learned how to fall because I knew someone would always catch me. The cruel irony of it settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Our parents had created two broken daughters through opposite means. They had loved Sophie too much and loved me too little, and both paths had led to damage that would take years to repair. I've been so angry at you, Taylor, Sophie continued, tears flowing freely now. I've spent years resenting you for being everything I couldn't be. But the truth is, I was never angry at you. I was angry at myself for being so weak, and I was angry at Mum and Dad for making me that way. You were just an easy target because you seemed so untouchable, so perfect, so above it all. I'm not perfect, I said quietly. I'm just as broken as you are, just in different ways. Sophie nodded a small, sad gesture of understanding. I know that now. I think I've always known it, but admitting it would have meant admitting that our whole family was built on lies. And I wasn't ready to face that. Mum reached out towards Sophie, her face wet with tears. Sweetheart, we never meant to hurt you. We were trying to protect you. You were trying to protect yourselves, Sophie shot back, but without venom. Just exhaustion. You were so afraid of me failing that you never let me try. And now I'm 32 years old with no idea how to be a functioning adult. The room fell silent again, all of us sitting with the weight of truths that had been buried for decades. Dad was still crying quietly. Mum looked like she had aged 10 years in the past hour, and Sophie stood in the middle of it all, finally visible, in a way she had never been before. Then her expression shifted, a new wave of anxiety crossing her features. And there's something else, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something I've been hiding from all of you. Sophie took a shaky breath, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides, as she prepared to reveal whatever she had been carrying. I watched her struggle with the words, seeing for the first time how much effort it took for her to be honest, how foreign the act of confessing something shameful must feel to someone who had been protected from consequences her entire life. I owe $43,000, she finally said. Credit card debt, personal loans, money I borrowed trying to pay for training courses and certifications that were supposed to help me get a real job. Mum's hand flew to her mouth. Dad's face went slack with shock. Neither of them said anything, but their silence spoke volumes. They had no idea. The daughter they thought they knew everything about, the one they had monitored and protected and hovered over for 32 years, had been hiding a catastrophe from them this entire time. How? Mum finally managed to whisper. When did this happen? Why didn't you tell us? Sophie laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sad. Because I wanted to prove I could do something on my own. Because every time I came to you with a problem, you fixed it, and I was so tired of being fixed. I wanted to fix myself for once. She began passing, her words coming faster now, as if the dam had broken and everything she had been holding back was flooding out at once. 3 years ago, I enrolled in a business certification program. It cost $8,000, and I put it on a credit card because I didn't want to ask you for money. I told myself I would pay it off once I got a job using the certification. But the job never came, and the interest kept adding up, and instead of telling anyone, I enrolled in another program, then another, then another. I thought about all the training courses she had mentioned during our phone call, the desperate attempts to accumulate credentials that would compensate for her lack of experience. Each one had been a gamble, a bet, that this time would be different, that this qualification would be the key that finally opened the door to independence. I applied for jobs, Sophie continued. So many jobs. 5 serious attempts over the past 2 years, alone, positions that could have been careers if I had gotten them. I made it to interviews 3 times, and every single time they asked about my experience, my work history, my track record of actually doing the things I claimed I could do, and I had nothing. Dad shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. But we would have helped you. We would have supported you through any training you wanted. That's exactly why I didn't tell you. Sophie's voice rose sharply. Every time you helped me, it proved that I couldn't do anything on my own. I needed to prove just once that I was capable of handling something without you stepping in to rescue me. But I couldn't. I failed over and over, and instead of admitting it, I just dug myself deeper into debt. Mum was crying again, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. We thought you were doing fine. You never said anything was wrong. You seemed happy when we gave you the car. I was happy about the car, Sophie admitted, her voice dropping, for about 5 minutes. And then I realised that it was just another rescue. Another gift to solve a problem I was supposed to handle myself. And it doesn't even solve the real problem, because the real problem is that I have no money, no job, and no idea how to get either. She stopped pacing and turned to face our parents directly. Do you know what the insurance costs on that car? Do you know how much I'm paying just to keep it on the road? The car, you gave me the one you saved for 7 years to buy, is going to bankrupt me. I can barely afford the monthly insurance payments on top of the minimum payments on my credit cards. Within 6 months, maybe less, something is going to give. I'll miss a payment somewhere and the whole house of cards will come crashing down. The irony was devastating. Our parents had spent years building a fund to give Sophie a fresh start, and in doing so, they had given her a financial burden she couldn't sustain. The car that was supposed to launch her toward independence was actually accelerating her toward complete financial collapse. The car is my only asset, Sophie said quietly. It's the only thing of value I have, and I'm going to lose it eventually because I can't afford to keep it. Everything you did, all those years of saving all that money Taylor sent that you funneled into the fund, it's all going to disappear because you gave it to someone who doesn't know how to hold on to anything. Dad buried his face in his hands. Mum reached for Sophie, but my sister stepped back, holding up her hand to keep distance between them. I'm not telling you this, so you'll bail me out, Sophie said firmly. I'm telling you because Taylor deserves to know where her money went. She deserves to know that the fund built from her contributions is sitting in my driveway, slowly becoming another failure I can't afford. The room fell into heavy silence. I looked at my parents, both of them shattered by revelations they had never anticipated. I looked at Sophie standing alone in the middle of the room, finally stripped of all pretense and protection. And I felt something unexpected stirring in my chest. Not satisfaction at seeing them suffer, not vindication at being proven right about the dysfunction I had always sensed, something closer to clarity. We were all broken, all 4 of us damaged by the same system of misguided love and misplaced priorities. The only difference was that I had broken in a direction that forced me to become self-sufficient, while Sophie had broken in a direction that made her dependent. Neither outcome was a victory. I stood up slowly and I watched everyone in the room tense. Mum braced herself against the couch cushion. Dad looked up from his hands with an expression of dread. Sophie's chin lifted slightly, as if preparing to absorb whatever judgment I was about to deliver. They were waiting for me to condemn them, to add up all the ways they had failed me, and present them with a bill they could never repay. They expected anger accusations, perhaps, even the announcement that I was cutting them out of my life forever. But standing there looking at the wreckage of my family, laid bare before me, I realised that destruction wasn't what I wanted. It had never been what I wanted. What I wanted was something far more difficult to achieve than revenge. I wanted healing, not just for myself, but for all of us. And what I said next surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I looked at my family, at their tear-streaked faces and hunched shoulders and the weight of guilt pressing down on all of them, and I made a choice. Not to forgive and forget, not to pretend that everything was fine, but to do something harder than either of those options. I chose to be honest about what I needed, while leaving the door open for genuine change. I'm not going to yell at you, I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. I'm not going to list every way you've hurt me or demand apologies that won't change anything. What I'm going to do is tell you exactly what happens from here, and then you can decide what you want to do with that information. Mum nodded frantically, eager for any path forward. Dad lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed but attentive. Sophie remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself protectively. First, the money stops, completely and permanently. I let the words settle before continuing. I will not pay anyone's debts or cover anyone's expenses anymore. Not yours, not Sophie's, not anyone in this family's. Each of you will take full responsibility for your own financial decisions starting today. No more emergency calls. No more requests for help with bills or car repairs or medical expenses. If you need money, you'll have to find it somewhere other than my bank account. No one argued. No one even seemed surprised. After everything that had been revealed today, they had no ground left to stand on. Second the fund. I reached into the folder I had brought and pulled out a document my lawyer had prepared. My attorney has drafted a formal demand letter requesting the return of $127,000 within 30 days. This is based on the principle of unjust enrichment, which means you received money under false pretenses and benefited from it without my informed consent. Dad's face went pale. Taylor, we don't have that kind of money. The car alone cost over $30,000. We spent most of what was left on the Christmas celebration. I know, I said. I'm not expecting you to write me a check tomorrow. But I need you to understand that legally I have a claim to that money. Whether I pursue it is my choice, and right now I'm choosing not to take this to court. But the demand letter exists, and my lawyer has copies of all the documentation. If anything changes, if you try to take advantage of me again, or pretend none of this happened, that option remains on the table. Mum's hands were shaking. We would never do that. We've learned our lesson. I hope so, I said without softening my tone. Because there's something else you need to know. My lawyer pointed out that any gift over $15,000 per year to a single recipient is supposed to be reported to the IRS. Over the past 7 years, I've given you well over $100,000 that neither of us reported properly. If anyone ever audits your finances, or mine, this could create serious problems. The colour drained from both my parents' faces. They had never considered the legal implications of what they had been doing, never thought beyond the immediate benefit of having access to my money. I'm not going to report you, I continued. I'm not interested in getting anyone in trouble with the government, but I need you to understand the risk you took, not just with my trust, but with both our financial futures. You treated my money like it had no consequences, and that was reckless in more ways than one. Sophie spoke for the first time since her confession. What about my debt? What am I supposed to do about $43,000? I turned to my sister, seeing her clearly now, not as the favoured child who had stolen my parents' love, but as someone just as damaged as I was by the family we had been born into. You're going to have to figure that out yourself, Sophie. I know that sounds harsh, but it's the only way you're ever going to learn how to stand on your own feet. There are debt counselling services, payment plans, options you can explore. But I won't be paying it off for you, and neither should Mum and Dad. Sophie nodded slowly, fear and something that might have been relief mixing in her expression. Fear of the struggle ahead, but perhaps relief at finally being expected to handle it herself. Finally, I said, looking at each of my family members in turn, I want to be clear about where we stand going forward. I still love you, despite everything that's happened, despite the lies and the exclusion and the years of being treated like an afterthought. I still love all of you. But I love myself more, and loving myself means I will not allow anyone to treat me the way you've been treating me. I picked up the folder and held it against my chest. If you want me in your life, you'll respect these boundaries. You'll prove that you've changed through actions, not words. That means no more lying, no more manipulating, no more treating me like I exist only to solve your problems. If you can do that genuinely and consistently over time, then maybe we can rebuild something real. But if you can't, if you slip back into old patterns and expect me to just accept it, then I will walk away and not look back. The ultimatum hung in the air heavy with finality. This was not a negotiation. This was a statement of terms offered with compassion, but backed by the steel of someone who had finally learned her own worth. Mum stood and crossed the room toward me, stopping just short of reaching out. I'm so sorry, Taylor, for everything. I know those words don't fix anything, but I need you to know that I mean them. Show me, I said simply. Don't tell me, show me. I gathered my things and moved toward the door, emotionally exhausted, but strangely lighter than I had felt in years. The truth was finally out, the boundaries were finally set, and whatever happened next was up to them. Dad caught up with me just as I reached my car. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of his failures visible in every line on his face. But there was something else in his expression too, something desperate and hopeful and terrified all at once. "Wait," he said, his voice rough. "There's something I need to give you. Something I should have given you years ago." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, its edges softened by time and handling. He pressed it into my hand with trembling fingers. "I've been carrying this for 3 years," he said. "I wrote it the day you got your big promotion. I never had the courage to send it." I sat in my car for a long time before opening the envelope. The engine was off, the winter air slowly seeping through the windows, but I barely noticed the cold. All I could focus on was the worn paper in my hands, the edges soft from years of being handled, carried, looked at, but never sent. The envelope had my name written on the front in my father's handwriting. Not my full name, not the formal Taylor he used in serious conversations, but the nickname he had called me when I was very young, before Sophie was born, before everything became complicated. Tay-Tay. I hadn't heard that name in over 20 years. Seeing it now in his familiar script made something catch in my throat. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out the letter inside. 2 pages handwritten on lined notebook paper, the kind we always had around the house when I was growing up. The date at the top confirmed what Dad had said. He had written this 3 years ago, around the time I received my biggest promotion, the one that moved me into senior management, and came with a salary that finally made me feel financially secure. I remembered that week vividly. I had called home to share the news, proud and excited, hoping my parents would celebrate with me. Mum had said congratulations in a distracted voice, and then immediately pivoted to talking about Sophie's latest crisis. Dad had stayed silent through most of the call, offering only a brief "good for you" before hanging up. I had told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need their approval, but the disappointment had lingered for weeks afterward. Now, holding this letter, I understood that something else had been happening on the other end of that phone call. Something I had never suspected. The letter began simply. "Dear Tay-Tay, I'm writing this because I can't say it out loud. Every time I try, the words get stuck somewhere between my brain and my mouth, and what comes out is either nothing at all or something that makes things worse. So, I'm putting it on paper, hoping that maybe this way I can finally tell you what I should have told you years ago." I blinked back the moisture gathering in my eyes and kept reading. "I heard your news today about the promotion. Your mother thinks I wasn't paying attention, but I was. I heard every word, and when you hung up, I went to the garage and sat in my truck for an hour trying to understand why I felt so terrible about something that should have made me proud." The next paragraph hit me like a wave. "The truth is, Taylor, I'm afraid of losing you, not in the way a parent fears losing a child to accident or illness. I'm afraid of losing you because you don't need me. You never have, not really. From the time you were a little girl, you figured things out on your own. When you struggled, you found solutions. When you fell, you got back up before I could even reach you. And every time I watched you handle something by yourself, a part of me felt relieved, but another part felt useless." I read those words twice, trying to absorb what they meant. Sophie has always needed me. Every problem she has, every struggle she faces, I can step in and fix it. That makes me feel like a father, like I'm doing my job, like I matter. But with you, there's nothing to fix. You've built your entire life without my help, and while I should be proud of that, the truth is, it scares me. Because if you don't need me to solve your problems, then what do you need me for? What kind of father am I to a daughter who never asks for anything? The handwriting became slightly less steady in the next section, as if the pen had trembled while writing. "I know I've been focusing on Sophie too much. I know you've noticed. I've seen the look in your eyes at family gatherings, the way you pull back when I rush to help her with something while ignoring you completely. I tell myself it's because you're strong, because you can handle yourself, because you don't need the attention the way she does. But that's just an excuse. The real reason is that helping Sophie makes me feel necessary, and being around you reminds me that I'm not." A tear slipped down my cheek and landed on the paper. I wiped it away quickly, not wanting to smudge the words. "I don't know how to be your father without fixing your problems. You've never needed me to fix anything, and I didn't know how else to show love. I kept waiting for you to need something, anything that I could help with. And when you never did, I convinced myself that meant you didn't need me at all. So I stopped trying. I focused on Sophie because she let me feel useful, and I let you drift away because I didn't know how to hold on." The final page was shorter, just a few paragraphs. "I'm writing this on the day of your promotion because I realised something sitting in that truck. I realised that I've been so afraid of being useless to you that I made myself useless to you. I pulled away because I didn't know how to connect without being needed, and in doing so, I created the exact situation I was afraid of. You don't need me now because I never taught you that you could count on me. That's my failure, not yours." And the closing lines blurred through my tears. "I want to send this to you. I want to call you and read it out loud and tell you everything I've been too cowardly to say. But I know I won't. I'm too ashamed of who I've become and what I've done. By the time you read this, I hope I've found the courage to say these things in person. I hope I've become the father you deserve. But if you're reading this letter and I still haven't changed, then please know that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for every moment I made you feel invisible. I'm sorry for choosing the easy daughter over the strong one. And I'm sorry that I'm so weak." The letter was signed simply. "Dad." I sat in my car as the winter light faded around me, holding the pages that had been written 3 years ago and carried ever since. 3 years of my father walking around with this confession in his pocket, knowing what he should do, but never finding the strength to do it. 3 years of silence that could have been filled with understanding, if only he had been brave enough to send an envelope. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't erase the hurt or justify the lies or make up for the decades of being overlooked. But it explained something I had never understood. My father hadn't ignored me because he didn't love me. He had ignored me because he didn't know how to love someone who didn't need saving. I wiped my tears and sat with that realization for a long time. Then I made a decision that would surprise even myself. The decision came to me in the middle of a sleepless night a week after the family meeting. I was lying in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had been revealed and everything that still needed to heal. The letter from my father was on my nightstand, read so many times that the creases had started to soften and fray. I had spent days processing its contents, cycling through anger and grief, and something that felt dangerously close to understanding. But understanding didn't mean I was ready to go back to the way things had been. Some things once broken can only be rebuilt into something entirely new. That was when I realized what I needed to do. Not revenge, not reconciliation. Something in between. I needed to build a life that was truly mine, one that hadn't been shaped by the constant pull of a family that had taken more than they had ever given. I needed to find out who Taylor Collins was when she wasn't playing the role of the reliable daughter, the invisible sister, the endless source of financial support. I started with my apartment, the place I had lived for 5 years, the home I had saved and sacrificed to afford suddenly felt like a cage. Every corner held memories of phone calls, asking for money, of holidays spent alone, of carefully curated independence that had been less about freedom and more about survival. I called a real estate agent and put it on the market before I could talk myself out of it. The decision felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. I began searching for homes in places I had never considered before. Small coastal towns where the pace of life was slower, where the ocean could remind me every day that there were forces in the world much larger than family drama. I found a real estate listing for a cottage 2 hours from the city, perched on a bluff overlooking the water, and something in my chest expanded just looking at the photos. It wasn't practical. It wasn't close to my office or my routine or anything familiar, but it felt like possibility. and I had spent too many years ignoring that feeling. The second thing I did was find a therapist. I had resisted the idea for years, telling myself I was fine, that I had handled my childhood and emerged stronger for it. But sitting in that first session, trying to explain why I had spent 3 decades being invisible in my own family, I realised how much I had been carrying without even knowing it. The therapist didn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. She just listened, asked questions that made me uncomfortable, and helped me see patterns I had been too close to recognise. We talked about boundaries. Not the angry, defensive kind I had set at the family meeting, but the healthy, sustainable kind that would allow me to have relationships without losing myself in them. She helped me understand that saying no to my family wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. That loving myself more than I loved their approval wasn't selfish. It was necessary. I started painting again. It was something I had loved as a teenager before college, and career and family obligations had crowded it out of my life. I set up a small easel by the window of my apartment and spent evenings experimenting with colours and shapes, creating images that had no purpose other than to exist. Most of them were terrible. Some of them surprised me with their beauty. All of them reminded me that I was more than just a problem solver, more than just a source of support for people who had never learned to support themselves. I read books that had been gathering dust on my shelves for years. I took long walks in the mornings before work, watching the city wake up around me and feeling connected to something larger than my own worries. I learned to cook meals that took time and attention, dishes I would never have bothered with when I was always rushing to meet someone else's needs. Slowly, piece by piece, I began assembling a life that belonged entirely to me. I didn't cut off my family completely. That would have been the easy choice, the dramatic ending that part of me craved. But I had read my father's letter too many times to believe that severing ties would bring me peace. Instead, I established clear boundaries. Monthly check-in calls scheduled in advance, lasting no more than 30 minutes. No discussions about money, no requests for help, no guilt trips disguised as family updates. If anyone crossed those lines, I would end the call immediately and wait until the next scheduled time to try again. The first few calls were awkward. Mum kept trying to steer the conversation towards Sophie's struggles, toward the challenges they were facing now that my financial support had ended. I redirected her gently but firmly, each time asking about her garden, about the weather, about anything that wasn't designed to make me feel responsible for problems I hadn't created. She learned slowly, but she learned. Dad was different. He seemed afraid to say much of anything, as if every word might be the wrong one. But he stayed on the line listening when I talked about my new apartment search, offering occasional comments that showed he was paying attention. It wasn't the relationship I had wanted as a child, but it was something. A foundation, maybe, for something better in the future. Sophie and I didn't talk much at first. The wounds between us was too fresh, too complicated to address over monthly phone calls. But she sent me a text a few weeks after the meeting, just 2 sentences. I started a debt management program. Thought you should know. I texted back a single word. Good. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was a start. 3 weeks into my new routine, I was beginning to feel something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but the quiet contentment that comes from living according to your own values, instead of everyone else's expectations. I had put in an offer on the coastal cottage. I had found a therapist who challenged me without judging me. I was painting and reading and walking and slowly becoming the person I might have been if I had never had to carry my family's weight. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday evening, and when I saw Mum's name on the screen, I almost didn't answer. It wasn't our scheduled call time, and I had been strict about maintaining boundaries. But something made me pick up anyway, some instinct I couldn't quite explain. Mum's voice when she spoke was shaking in a way I had never heard before. The shaking in my mother's voice stopped me mid-step on the beach path. I had been walking along the shoreline near the cottage I was in the process of buying, watching the waves roll in with the kind of steady rhythm that had become my meditation over the past few weeks. But something in Mum's tone cut through the peace I had been cultivating, pulling me back into the world I had been trying to create distance from. "Taylor," she said, and just my name on her lips carried more weight than I had heard in years. "I know this isn't our scheduled call. I know I'm not supposed to contact you outside of the times we agreed on, but I needed to talk to you, and I couldn't wait another 2 weeks." I found a bench overlooking the water and sat down, bracing myself for whatever was coming. "What's wrong?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of my mother's uneven breathing. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thick with tears she was clearly trying to hold back. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the family meeting, more than I've ever done in my life probably, and I need you to know some things before I tell you why I'm really calling." I waited, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. "I've been a terrible mother to you, Taylor. Not just neglectful, not just blind to what your father was doing, but actively complicit in it. Every time he chose Sophie over you, I could have spoken up. I could have demanded that he treat you both fairly. Instead, I made excuses. I told myself you were fine, that you didn't need the attention. Sophie did that keeping peace in the family was more important than standing up for my own daughter." The tears broke through as she continued, her words coming faster now. "I watched your father build that fund for years, watched him redirect the money you sent us into an account meant only for Sophie, and I said nothing. I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that he knew what he was doing, that somehow it would all work out in the end." "You knew about the fund before I did," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. I had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it still stung. "6 months before you found out," Mom admitted, her voice dropping with the shame. "I saw the statements by accident just like you did. And when I confronted your father about it, he told me it was none of my business, that he was handling things, that I should trust him. And I did. I trusted him because it was easier than fighting with him. I trusted him because I was too much of a coward to stand up for you." I closed my eyes, letting the salt air fill my lungs. The confession wasn't surprising, but it was painful nonetheless. My mother had known. She had seen what was happening and chosen to look away, prioritizing her marriage over her relationship with her daughter. "I'm not telling you this to make excuses," Mum continued. "There are no excuses for what we did. I'm telling you because I need you to know that I understand now. I understand that I failed you in ways I never let myself see before. And I understand that no amount of apologizing can undo 36 years of being less than the mother you deserved." The waves kept rolling in indifferent to human drama, constant and calming in their repetition. I focused on them while I processed what my mother was saying. "Your father and I have started counselling," Mom said after a moment. "Family therapy, couples therapy, everything we should have done decades ago. It's hard. Some sessions leave us barely able to look at each other. But we're trying to understand how we became the people who could hurt our own child so deeply without even realising it." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Is this your way of asking me to come back to pretend everything is fine because you're working on it?" No, that's not why I'm calling." Mum's voice steadied slightly, taking on a tone I recognised from my childhood, the tone she used when she was trying to be strong despite feeling anything but. "I'm calling because I wanted you to know that we're trying to change, not because we expect you to forgive us, but because you deserve to know that your words at the family meeting didn't fall on deaf ears. We heard you, Taylor. For maybe the first time in your life, we really heard you." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realised was still there. "Thank you for telling me that." "There's something else," Mum said, and her voice began to shake again. "Something I need to ask you, even though I have no right to ask you for anything ever again." I tensed, waiting for the request I had been dreading since I saw her name on my phone screen. "It's about Sophie." Mum's voice broke completely, a sob escaping before she could contain it. "She's in real trouble, Taylor. Not financial trouble, not the usual crises we always worried about. Something much worse. She's having a complete breakdown and we don't know how to help her. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications. I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. What do you mean, a breakdown? After the family meeting, she tried to do what you suggested. She enrolled in a debt management program, started applying for entry-level jobs, things she should have been doing years ago. At first, it seemed like she was making progress. She was focused, determined, more like herself than she'd been in years. Mum paused, gathering herself before continuing. But then, the rejections started coming. Job after job turned her down, and each one hit her harder than the last. She started isolating herself, barely eating, not the sleeping. Your father and I thought she just needed time to adjust, that the struggle would make her stronger eventually. What happened? 3 days ago, she stopped getting out of bed entirely. She won't talk to us, won't eat, won't shower, won't do anything except stare at the wall and cry. We called her doctor, and he said it sounds like a severe depressive episode, possibly triggered by the sudden loss of her support systems, combined with repeated failures she didn't know how to handle. I stood frozen on the beach, the phone pressed to my ear, the waves suddenly sounding very far away. Sophie, my sister, who had been given everything, protected from every hardship, sheltered from every struggle that might have taught her resilience. She had finally been forced to face the real world, and the real world had broken her. "We're terrified, Taylor," Mum whispered. "The doctor wants her to see a psychiatrist, but she refuses to leave the house. She keeps saying there's no point, that she's failed at everything, and she'll fail at this too. Your father sits outside her door for hours every day, begging her to come out, and she won't even respond to him." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Because she talks about you. In her worst moments, when she does speak, she talks about you. She says she finally understands why you left, why you stopped helping, why you had to protect yourself from all of us. And she says she wishes she could tell you that she doesn't blame you anymore, but she doesn't think she has the right to contact you." The irony was almost unbearable. My sister, who had spent years resenting me, who had accused me of being cold and selfish and unworthy of family, was now lying in bed wishing she could apologize. "What do you want me to do?" I asked Sasha quietly. "I don't know," Mum admitted. "I have no right to ask you to help after everything we've put you through. But I don't know what else to do. The doctors and the therapists and the medication they want to put her on, none of it will matter if she doesn't have a reason to fight. And I think maybe you're the only person who can give her that reason." I stood frozen off the beach as Mum continued describing just how bad things had gotten. Mum's voice continued through the phone, each word adding another layer to the picture of devastation I was trying to comprehend. The waves kept crashing against the shore below me, but I no longer heard them. All I could hear was my mother describing the unravelling of my sister's life in painful detail. The job she was so excited about, the one 40 minutes away that she needed the car to get to, she lost it 3 weeks ago, Mum said, her voice strained from crying. "She tried so hard, Taylor. For the first time in her life, she really tried. But the anxiety was eating her alive. She couldn't sleep because she was worried about the debt. She couldn't focus at work because she was terrified of making mistakes. And when she started making mistakes, the fear got worse, which led to more mistakes until finally her supervisor called her in and told her it wasn't working out." I thought about everything Sophie had confessed at the family meeting, the $43,000 in debt, the years of failed attempts to build independence, the crushing weight of expectations she had never learned to carry. She had been thrown into the deep end without ever learning how to swim, and now she was drowning. "What about the car?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Mum let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a bitter laugh. "Gone. The bank repossessed it 3 weeks ago, right after she lost the job. She couldn't make the insurance payments anymore. and once she missed those, everything fell apart. She called us in the middle of the night, hysterical, saying they had come to take it away. Your father drove out immediately, but by the time he got there, it was already loaded on the truck. The car that had been the centerpiece of Christmas, the gift that represented 7 years of saving, funded almost entirely by money I had sent under false pretenses. Gone in less than 2 months, taken back by the bank because Sophie couldn't afford to keep it. The irony was so sharp, it almost hurt to contemplate. She moved back in with us after that, Mum continued. There was nowhere else for her to go. Her apartment lease was up and she couldn't afford to renew it, and all her friends had drifted away over the years because she was always too busy being rescued to maintain real relationships. I closed my eyes, picturing my sister in our childhood home, surrounded by memories of a life that had been carefully constructed to keep her dependent. The same house where I had learned to be invisible, where I had absorbed the lesson that my worth was measured by what I could provide rather than who I was. Sophie was trapped there now with no job, no car, no money, and no idea how to build herself back up. At first, we thought the move would help, Mum said. We thought being home would give her stability while she figured things out. But she's gotten worse every day. She barely leaves her room. Sometimes she doesn't eat for 2 days straight. I leave food outside her door and find it untouched hours later. She won't talk to us, won't answer when we knock, won't do anything except lie there and cry. The image was heartbreaking, even through the complicated layers of resentment I still carried toward my sister. Whatever Sophie had done, whatever she had said to me, she was still a person in pain. She was still the little girl I had protected during thunderstorms when we were children before our parents' favoritism had driven a wedge between us. Have you tried getting her professional help? I asked. We've tried everything. We called her doctor who prescribed medication that she refuses to take. We contacted a therapist who does home visits, but Sophie won't see her. We even called out a crisis line, and they said, unless she's an immediate danger to herself, we can't force her into treatment. Mum's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm so scared, Taylor. I sit outside her door for hours, listening for any sound, terrified that one day there won't be any sounds to listen for. The implication hung heavy between us. This wasn't just depression. This was a crisis that could become something much worse if it wasn't addressed. What about you and Dad? I asked. How are you managing? Mum was quiet for a moment. We're struggling. Without your support, we've had to cut everything. The cable, the second car, all the little luxuries we took for granted. Your father found part-time work at a hardware store to help cover the bills. I've started cleaning houses for some of the neighbours. It's humbling, but it's honest work, and we're learning to live within our actual means for the first time in years. I felt a complicated mix of emotions at this news. Part of me was satisfied that they were finally facing the consequences of their choices. Another part felt guilty for that satisfaction, and underneath it all was a strange kind of respect for their willingness to adapt rather than ask me for money again. But the money isn't what matters right now, Mum continued. We can figure out the money. What we can't figure out is how to help Sophie. We spent so many years protecting her from everything hard that we never taught her how to survive hard things. And now she's facing the hardest thing she's ever experienced, and she has no tools to cope with it. What do you want me to do? I asked again the same question I had posed earlier, still unanswered. Something happened yesterday that made me think you might be able to reach her when we can't. Mum's voice shifted, becoming more focused despite her tears. Sophie was cleaning out some old boxes in her closet, probably just looking for something to distract herself. And she found a letter. An old letter, still sealed, with her name on it in your grandmother's handwriting. My breath caught. Grandma rose. Even from beyond the grave, she was still trying to reach her granddaughters. Sophie opened it and read it, and for the first time in weeks, she came out of her room. She sat at the kitchen table holding that letter, just staring at it. And when I asked what it said, she started crying in a different way. Not hopeless crying, but something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. What did the letter say? I don't know the exact words. Sophie wouldn't show it to me, but she said something that stuck with me. She said Grandma Rose wrote to her about strength and failure and getting back up after falling down. She said the letter mentioned something about comparing herself to you and walking her own path with pride. The words resonated with something Margaret had told me months ago about Grandma Rose's concerns for both her granddaughters, her understanding that they were being damaged in different ways by the same dysfunctional system. Sophie kept saying she didn't understand what it meant, Mum continued. She kept asking how Grandma Rose knew what was going to happen, how she could have written something so perfect for this exact moment. And then she said your name, Taylor. She said she thought you might be the only person who could help her understand. I stood on the beach, the phone pressed to my ear, the weight of my family's pain pressing against the boundaries I had so carefully constructed. The letter is from your grandmother, Mum said, her voice breaking again. And I think Sophie needs to hear from you, Taylor. You're the only one who might understand what it means. You're the only one who knew Grandma Rose the way Sophie never got to. I drove to my parents' house the next morning, arriving before noon with no plan for what I would say or do. The only thing I knew for certain was that I needed to see. Sophie needed to understand what Grandma Rose had written, needed to find out if there was still a bridge between my sister and me that hadn't been completely burned. Mum met me at the door with red-rimmed eyes and a hug I wasn't expecting. I let her hold me for a moment before gently pulling away and asking where Sophie was. She pointed upstairs without a word, her expression a mixture of hope and fear that I would somehow make things worse. The hallway leading to Sophie's old bedroom felt longer than I remembered. Each step brought back memories from childhood, from summers spent running up and down this corridor, from nights when we would sneak into each other's rooms to whisper secrets after our parents fell asleep. Those days felt like they belonged to different people entirely. I knocked softly on Sophie's door and waited. No response. I knocked again and said her name, keeping my voice gentle and neutral. Still nothing. Finally, I turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into the dim room where my sister had been hiding from the world. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the midday sun and casting everything in a grey half-light. Sophie was lying on her side, in the bed facing the wall, her body curled into itself like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. The room smelled stale, like air that hadn't circulated in too long, and I noticed plates of untouched food stacked on the dresser. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask how she was feeling, or try to convince her to get up, or offer any of the well-meaning platitudes that probably everyone else had been showering her with. Instead, I simply walked to the chair beside her bed and sat down. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, offering nothing but my presence and whatever comfort silence could provide. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe more. The only sounds were Sophie's occasional sniffles and the distant noise of traffic outside. I watched the dust particles float in the thin strip of light coming through the gap in the curtains, and thought about all the years we had lost to misunderstanding and resentment. Finally, Sophie stirred. She turned her head slightly, just enough to see me from the corner of her eye, and her voice came out rough and cracked from disuse. "You came." "I came." She was quiet again for a long moment, then slowly pushed herself up to a sitting position. She looked terrible, her hair tangled and unwashed, her face pale and gaunt in ways that made her seem years older than she was. But her eyes, when they finally met mine, held something I hadn't seen in them before. Clarity, exhaustion, and underneath it all, a desperate kind of hope. Mum told you about the letter?" I nodded. Sophie reached under her pillow and pulled out an envelope, its edges worn from handling. She held it for a moment, looking at it like it contained something precious and terrifying in equal measure, then extended it toward me. "I've read it 100 times, but I don't think I really understand it. I was hoping maybe you could help." I took the envelope carefully, feeling the weight of Grandma Rose's presence in the simple act of holding something she had touched. The paper inside was brittle with age, the ink slightly faded but still legible. I unfolded it and began to read aloud, my voice steady, despite the emotion building in my chest. "My dearest Sophie," the letter began. "I'm writing this because there are things I need to say to you, things I worry I won't have the chance to say in person. You're young now, and these words might not make sense yet. But someday, when life has knocked you down and you're struggling to get back up, I hope you'll find this and know that your grandmother saw you. Really saw you." I paused, glancing at Sophie. Tears were already streaming down her face, but she nodded for me to continue. "I see you comparing yourself to Taylor. I see the way you watch her, the way you measure yourself against her achievements and find yourself lacking. I need you to understand something important, sweetheart. True strength isn't never falling down, it's getting back up. Taylor falls too, even if no one notices. She just learned early how to get up quietly without asking for help. That's not better or worse than any other way of being strong. It's just different." The words hit me as hard as they seemed to hit Sophie. Grandma Rose had understood both of us in ways our parents never had. "You and Taylor are on different paths," the letter continued. "Stop trying to walk hers. Walk yours with pride even when it's harder, even when it takes longer, even when everyone around you seems to be moving faster. Your path is yours alone, and it has value that no one else can measure. I believe in you, Sophie. I believe you have strength you haven't discovered yet, and when you finally find it, it will be beautiful." The letter was signed simply, "All my love, Grandma Rose." I folded the paper and handed it back to Sophie, who clutched it against her chest like a lifeline. "She knew," Sophie whispered. "She knew what was going to happen to me. She knew I would end up here lost and broken and hating myself for not being you. She didn't know exactly what would happen. She just understood who we both were, maybe better than anyone else ever did." Sophie looked at me, then really looked at me, and the walls she had built over years of resentment seemed to crumble all at once. "I've always resented you, Taylor, from the time I was old enough to understand that you were the smart one, the capable one, the one who didn't need help. I hated you for making everything look so easy while I struggled with things that should have been simple." Her voice broke. "But the worst part is that I admired you too, so much, and hating someone you admire makes you feel like the most horrible person in the world." I reached out and took her hand, something I hadn't done in more years than I could count. "I never wanted to be better than you, Sophie. I never wanted to make you feel inferior or insufficient. I just wanted to be seen. I wanted Mum and Dad to look at me the way they looked at you, like I mattered, like I was worth protecting." "They made us compete without ever knowing it," Sophie said through her tears. "They gave me everything and gave you nothing, and we both ended up empty." "We both lost," I agreed quietly. "You lost the chance to develop independence. I lost the sense of belonging. Neither of us got what we actually needed." Sophie squeezed my hand, her grip weak but desperate. "I'm so sorry, Taylor, for everything I said, everything I thought about you, every time I blamed you for things that were never your fault. I was so busy being jealous of what you had that I never saw what you didn't have." I felt tears building in my own eyes, years of pain finding release in this dim bedroom where my sister had finally stopped running from the truth. Through her tears, Sophie looked at me with an expression that seemed to cost her everything she had left. "Will you help me learn how to get back up, not by rescuing me like Mum and Dad always did, but by showing me how you do it, how you fall and get up again without anyone noticing? Will you teach me how to be strong?" I stayed the night at my parents' house for the first time in years. Sophie and I talked until nearly 3 a.m, not about the big, painful things we had already covered, but about smaller memories, moments from childhood we had experienced so differently. By the time we finally fell asleep, something between us had shifted, not healed completely, but cracked open in a way that let light through. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Mum making breakfast in the kitchen. The smell of coffee and toast filled the air, ordinary and comforting in a way I hadn't associated with this house in a long time. Dad was already at the table looking tired, but more present than I had seen him in months. And Sophie, who had barely left her room in weeks, was sitting across from him, pale and fragile, but upright and dressed. Mum set plates in front of each of us and then took her own seat, completing the circle. For a moment, no one spoke. The four of us just sat there looking at each other across a table that had witnessed so many meals, filled with unspoken tension and hidden resentment. But this morning felt different. This morning felt like a beginning. "I think we need to talk about what happens next," I said, breaking the silence. Not about blame or the past or who did what to whom, about the future, about how each of us moves forward from here. Dad nodded slowly, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "We've been talking about that too, your mother and I. About what we need to do to become better people, better parents, even if it's too late to undo what we've already done." "It's not too late to change," I said. "It's just too late to pretend it doesn't matter." Mum reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "We've already enrolled in couples therapy, and we found a program for parents of adult children. Something that helps people like us understand the damage we've done and learn how to do better going forward. We started last week." I felt something ease in my chest at this news. They weren't just talking about change. They were already taking steps toward it. "What about you, Sophie?" I asked, turning to my sister. Sophie took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly around her own mug. I called the debt management program yesterday, the one I was supposed to start before everything fell apart. They said I can still enroll, that it's not too late. I have an appointment next Tuesday to go over my options. And work? I'm going to start applying for jobs again, real jobs, entry-level ones, the kind where you start at the bottom and work your way up. She looked down at the table. "I know I'm going to get rejected a lot. I know it's going to be hard, but I'm tired of being rescued. I want to rescue myself for once." The words were so different from anything I'd ever heard Sophie say that for a moment I almost didn't recognise her. This was the sister Grandma Rose had believed in, the one who had strength she hadn't discovered yet. She was finally starting to find it. "There's something I want to propose," I said, choosing my words carefully, "about the fund, the money that was built from what I sent over the years." The tension in the room immediately thickened. Money had been at the centre of so much pain in our family that even mentioning it felt dangerous. "I've been thinking about this for a while," I continued. "The fund has about $127,000 in it, minus whatever was spent on the car and Christmas. I'm not going to demand all of it back. That was never really what I wanted." Dad started to speak, but I held up my hand. "Here's what I propose. $50,000 gets released immediately to help with the most urgent debts. Sophie's credit cards, whatever medical bills have accumulated, the things that are charging interest and making the hole deeper every month. That money goes directly to paying those off, not into anyone's pocket." Sophie looked at me with wide eyes, clearly not expecting this kind of generosity after everything that had happened. "The remaining $77,000 gets split equally between Sophie and me. My half I'll take now as partial repayment for what was taken under false pretenses. Sophie's half goes into a trust that she can't access until she's demonstrated 1 full year of financial stability. That means 1 year of steady employment, 1 year of making payments on any remaining debts, 1 year of proving to herself and everyone else that she can stand on her own feet." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. I could see each of my family members processing the proposal, turning it over in their minds, looking for catches or conditions. "What counts as financial stability?" Sophie asked quietly. "Who decides if I've done enough?" "We'll set clear criteria together. A job held for at least a year, regular payments on your debts even if they're small, a budget you actually stick to, And most importantly, no asking anyone in this family for money during that time. If you need help, you find it elsewhere. That's how you prove you can do this. Sophie nodded slowly, her jaw set with determination. I can do that. I want to do that. Dad cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. Taylor, this is more than fair, more than we deserve after what we did. It's not about what you deserve. It's about what makes sense, about giving everyone a chance to move forward without being crushed by the weight of the past. Mum was crying again, but these tears seemed different, less desperate, more grateful. We won't waste this chance. I promise you, Taylor. We'll prove that we can change. Don't promise me, I said gently. Show me. Promises don't mean much in this family anymore. Actions do. The conversation continued for another hour, details and logistics, and the practical steps each person would take. But what struck me most was what didn't happen. No one made excuses. No one blamed anyone else. No one asked me to fix things or rescue them or take responsibility for problems I hadn't created. Instead, toward the end of the discussion, Dad asked a question that nearly brought me to tears. Taylor, I know we don't have any right to ask this, but we need to know. How do we rebuild your trust? What do we need to do specifically for you to believe that we've really changed? It was the first time in my life that anyone in my family had asked me what I needed without simultaneously asking for something in return. Time, I said. Consistency, following through on everything you've committed to today, not just for a month or two, but for years, and letting me set the pace. I'll reach out when I'm ready. I'll visit when it feels right. You need to trust me to know what I can handle. Everyone nodded. Everyone accepted. No one pushed back or tried to negotiate for more contact than I was offering. As I gathered my things to leave that afternoon, Dad stopped me at the door. His hands were shaking slightly as he pressed a small wrapped box into my palm. I was saving this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been carrying it for months, waiting for the right moment. I think maybe this is it. 6 months after the family meeting that changed everything, I stood on the deck of my new home and watched the sun rise over the ocean. The coastal cottage I had fallen in love with online was even more beautiful in person, its weathered shingles and wide windows perfectly suited to the quiet life I was building. The sound of waves had become my morning alarm, and the salt air had become the scent I associated with peace. I had opened Dad's gift that same afternoon. He gave it to me sitting in my car in their driveway with trembling hands. Inside the small box was an old photograph, one I had never seen before. It showed me as a toddler, maybe 2 or 3 years old, sitting on my father's lap while he read me a story. My small hand was pressed against his cheek, and both of us were laughing at something the camera had captured, but couldn't explain. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated love from a time before Sophie was born, before the dynamics shifted, before everything became tangled with favoritism and financial manipulation. Beneath the photo was a note in Dad's handwriting, the letters careful and deliberate, as if he had rewritten them many times before settling on the final version. You were never forgotten, Taylor. I just lost my way. Thank you for showing me the path back. I had cried then alone in my car holding that photograph and reading those words over and over until they stopped feeling like a revelation and started feeling like a truth I had always known but never been able to name. My father had loved me. He had just forgotten how to show it, buried under years of guilt and misguided priorities and the weight of a promise he couldn't keep. Now, 6 months later, that photograph sat on my mantelpiece in a simple wooden frame. I looked at it every morning as I made my coffee a reminder that even the most broken relationships can find their way back to something real if everyone is willing to do the work. My days had settled into a rhythm that felt entirely my own. I woke with the sun and spent the first hours of each morning working on canvases that captured the ocean in different moods and lights. Some of them were good enough to sell at the small gallery in town that had agreed to display my work. Most of them were just for me expressions of a creative side I had suppressed for too many years while I was busy being the responsible one. In the afternoons, I did consulting work for a handful of clients who valued my expertise enough to pay well for limited hours. I had left my old firm 3 months ago, trading the security of a full-time position for the freedom of being my own boss. The money was less predictable, but the life was infinitely richer. I chose my projects, set my own schedule, and never had to sacrifice another evening or weekend to someone else's priorities. The solitude I had once feared had become a gift. I read books on my deck until the stars came out. I walked to the beach in the early evening collecting shells and smooth stones that I kept in a jar by my door. I learned to cook elaborate meals just for myself, savouring the process as much as the result. For the first time in my life, I was living entirely for myself, and it felt not like selfishness, but like healing. The updates from my family arrived regularly, now not as requests for money or calls for rescue, but as genuine attempts to share their lives with me. Sophie had texted me just last week with a photo of her first paycheck from a job at a local accounting firm. It wasn't much, an entry-level position that barely covered her bills, but she had earned it entirely on her own. She had applied to over 40 jobs before getting. This one had survived rejection after rejection and had finally landed something through sheer persistence. The pride in her message was unmistakable, and I had felt my own pride swelling in response. Mum and Dad had sent me a video from their therapy group, a short clip, where they each shared something they had learned about healthy family dynamics. Dad talked about the difference between helping and enabling, about how his need to feel useful had blinded him to the harm he was causing. Mum spoke about her role as a silent partner in his mistakes, about her cowardice in choosing peace over justice. They both looked older than I remembered, but also somehow lighter, as if the burden of pretending had finally been lifted from their shoulders. I visited them once a month, now short trips that lasted only a day or two. The conversations were still careful, still healing, but they were real in a way they had never been before. We talked about our feelings instead of avoiding them. We acknowledged mistakes instead of burying them. And when disagreements arose, as they inevitably did, we worked through them with patience and honesty, rather than retreating into old patterns of silence and resentment. Sophie and I had our own relationship now, separate from our parents' influence. We talked on the phone every week, sometimes about practical things like her job and her progress with the debt management program, sometimes about deeper things like our shared childhood and the different ways it had shaped us. She was still learning to stand on her own feet, still struggling with the daily challenges that came so naturally to me, but felt foreign to her. But she was learning. Every week she got a little stronger, a little more confident, a little more like the person Grandma Rose had always believed she could become. Standing on my deck as the morning light spread across the water, I thought about everything that had led me to this moment. The Christmas I had spent alone eating leftover pasta while my family celebrated without me. The phone call from Dad asking for money he had no right to request. The decision to speak the truth, finally after 36 years of silence. I had started this journey thinking it was about revenge, about making my family pay for the way they had treated me, about forcing them to see the consequences of their choices. But somewhere along the way, the purpose had shifted. It stopped being about punishment and started being about liberation. By setting boundaries, by refusing to continue enabling their dysfunction, I had given everyone in my family something more valuable than money. I had given them the opportunity to grow. Sophie was learning independence for the first time in her life. Mum and Dad were confronting the patterns that had poisoned their parenting. And I was finally free from the weight of being the invisible provider, the endless source of support that everyone took for granted. The hardest thing I had ever done was saying no to people I loved. The scariest thing was walking away without knowing if they would ever find their way back. But real love, I had learned, isn't about rescuing people from their struggles. It's about trusting them to face those struggles themselves, even when it's terrifying to watch. I picked up my coffee and walked to the edge of the deck, letting the ocean breeze wash over me. The sun was fully up now, painting the water in shades of gold and pink, and I felt a gratitude so deep it brought tears to my eyes. That Christmas had been the loneliest night of my life, but it had also been the beginning of everything that followed. The pain had led to truth. The truth had led to boundaries, and the boundaries had led to healing, not just for me, but for everyone I loved. I didn't just free myself that Christmas, I freed all of us. And that's the greatest gift I could have given to them and to myself. Thank you for staying with me through Taylor's entire journey, from that lonely Christmas night with leftover pasta to the peaceful mornings on her ocean deck. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest act of love is learning to say no, even when it breaks our hearts to do it. Taylor spent 36 years being invisible in her own family, giving everything she had while receiving nothing in return. But when she finally found the courage to speak her truth and set boundaries, she didn't just save herself. She gave everyone she loved the chance to grow into better versions of themselves. Sophie learned to stand on her own feet. Her parents learned to face the damage they had caused. And Taylor discovered that strength isn't about carrying everyone else's weight. It's about trusting people to carry their own. If Taylor's story touched something in your heart, I would love to hear from you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you struggled to set boundaries with people who only seem to value what you could give them? Or maybe you were on the other side, like Sophie, realizing too late that being protected from every struggle had actually made you weaker. Whatever your experience, your story matters, and this community is here to listen. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest, which character you related to most, or what you would have done differently in Taylor's situation. Every comment helps this video reach more people who might need to hear this message, and I read every single one. If this is your first time here, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss another story. We share new content every week, stories about family healing resilience, and the complicated love that ties us all together. And if you know someone who needs to hear Taylor's message today, someone who has been giving too much to people who take them for granted, please share this video with them. Sometimes a story can say what we cannot find words for ourselves. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, remember that you deserve to be seen, not just needed. Take care of yourselves.